Films, the podcast that goes with bestlovedfilms.com. Let's begin by acknowledging that this land, the United States of America, was stewarded beautifully by hundreds of generations of Native Americans before any white people showed up. We want to thank them for that and promise to try to leave this land a little bit better. My name is Daniel Smith-Rousey. I'm a filmmaker, sometimes with a PhD in Film and American Studies. I've published 3 books about cinema and media. Today, I'm welcoming to the podcast a very, very special guest, longtime theater critic, arts journalist, and playwright, Mr. Sam Hurwitt. How are you, Sam?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here. My listeners and watchers are going to benefit from your insights, and I'm so excited about that. Any thoughts before we jump into the early 90s here, or the mid, or wherever we are here?
I mean, I have thoughts, but it was an interesting group of films to watch, or in most cases rewatch. I'd actually seen 4 out of 5 of them before, so
yeah,
3 of them when they came out. And,
right. Yeah, well, it's funny. The theatrical experience does, I think, it's something we should be continuing to talk about and integrate into our narratives, considering this pandemic we're in, where it feels like theatrical is becoming less of a part of our reality. And even in the very first film, Malcolm X, there was talk of like extra security needed, but okay, we're going to get to all that later. Well, I began last podcast by trying to account for why the early 90s was such an impressive time for these sort of milestones of the marginalized, because Sam, there's a lot of these films. So I don't know if it seems like it, but we're covering, there's a lot of films in a small amount of time compared to other periods of time of Hollywood history. So in other words, we've got a lot of interesting voices coming to the fore. Last podcast included like Thelma and Louise, Boys in the Hood. It's sort of like, what, I guess my question to you, Sam, and I don't have one answer to this, and I didn't have it last podcast either, but why? What was going on in the 90s? What was in the water, Sam? What was happening then that people just seemed to be more interested in like unheard voices than they had been for the previous years or whatever? I don't know. Was there something?
I mean, I can't attribute it to anything particular to the 90s, except that it was so overdue, I mean,
yes.
That,
yes. That's fair.
That the farther you look back, the more embarrassingly, either embarrassingly white or embarrassingly stereotyped, things are. And it's, whatever steps, in some case, really baby steps, and I will be talking about that, were being made at the time, were so sorely needed. So
yes. I think that, for me, I think 8 years of Reaganism had to have something to do with it. There had to be like a reaction, whatever you want to call it, a pendulum swing. I think on some level it was like there had been all this repression of sort of, I think, minority and women voices during Reagan. And so I think that was a sort of a burst. I think conscious hip hop was both a kind of a reflector and a director of that. Was like conscious hip hop was like, hey, that we're not in, this isn't just Reagan's America, or certainly not anymore, and I think there were other things like that. And one force of nature like that I think I should just start with, since we may as well get going, is Mr. Spike Lee. His biography was something I delved into when the podcast discussed She's Gotta Have It and Do the Right Thing. I don't need to repeat myself. But as explained in the book, Spike, Mike, Slackers and Dykes, for example, John Pearson's book, after Do the Right Thing in 1989, Spike Lee had established himself as this kind of post-Reagan truth teller, also a filmic innovator. He liked to tell his own stories. His early movies were his own stories. But they were original screenplays, right? But with so many friends begging him to tell other people's stories now, he knew the one he wanted to start with. His dream project since college would involve a story and storytellers that predated his birth. Okay, so let's jump in. Why not? We've set the stage. I think you've done a great job with that already, Sam. So thanks for that. Jazz producer Marvin Worth always said that he met Malcolm Little when they were both teenagers in jazz clubs. In 1967, he leveraged that Little legend into the film rights to Alex Haley's 1965 book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. Looking for the best possible writer, Worth hired James Baldwin, who took on the once blacklisted Arnold Pearl as writing partner, and the two of them adapted Haley's words into a fictionalized, personalized Malcolm X drama. After Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, about half of A-list Hollywood collaborated on the only documentary Sidney Lumet ever made, which is called King, a filmed record, Montgomery to Memphis, came out in 1970. Marvin Worth and Arnold Pearl, now working on what were they going to do with their Malcolm X sort of fictionalized drama. They weighed the success of the Martin Luther King doc. They weighed the fact that they were having problems sourcing their screenplay. A lot of people wouldn't talk to them. There was the controversy of Malcolm slaying. People couldn't agree how it had happened and why. And there were also the wishes of Betty Shabazz. That was another issue. So they put all that together, Sam, in a blender, and they finally shifted gears from fiction into nonfiction with a terrific 1972 documentary, Malcolm X, that was released by Warner Brothers and earned an Oscar nomination that one of its writers, Pearl, did not live to see. James Baldwin wrote a book about how little he wanted to repeat the adaptation experience. Worth spoke of his doc with pride, but also a little regret that it necessarily focused on the public and not the private Malcolm. So that sat there for 2 decades. Various producers took various meetings about a more, fictionalized Malcolm X movie. Among the temporarily attached talents were Sidney Lumet, David Bradley, Billy D. Williams, Calder Willingham, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, David Mamet, and finally Charles Fuller, an African-American who had blazed a trail with many of his plays, especially the Pulitzer-winning Soldier's Play. The rise of conscious hip hop that I just mentioned was one of the reasons that there was a 9-fold increase in sales of several books by Malcolm X by the time March 1990. That was a late 80s thing. People were just buying Malcolm X, that book. And then in March 1990, a certain glory-filled Oscar win happened for Mr. Denzel Washington, who wanted to play Malcolm X. These were the factors that convinced Warner Brothers that they had the quote-unquote means necessary to adapt Fuller's script with the white director who had adapted Fuller's A Soldier's Play into the excellent 1984 film A Soldier's Story, and who had also directed In the Heat of the Night to a Best Picture Oscar, Mr. Norman Jewison. However, Sam, when Spike Lee got wind of Warner's whims in May 90, it caused a public stink that was in many ways without precedent. And that's kind of why I want to hear what you think of this precedent of a director kind of going on TV. Well, okay, so what happened was Spike was already off and on CNN anyway, and whoever else would put him on TV about whatever racial controversy was in the news in 1990. Now he was using that platform to demand that a major studio hire him to direct a major film. Now, here's the thing that gets me, Sam. At the time, there was absolutely no conversation regarding movies about a marginalized group being directed by a member of that marginalized group. When it did happen, as in the case of, for example, La Bamba, it was usually because the movie was small and no one else particularly wanted the job. An example of what I'm talking about is, I mentioned this last podcast. In July 1990, 20th Century Fox had gathered major actors and director David Anspaugh, a man who I doubt you have heard of, maybe you have. They gathered, they're in Indiana in a ballpark to make a league of their own. He's got a bunch of these actors, like Daryl Hannah's there, Laura Dern's there. There's a bunch of these actors there, but only the surprise hit status of the summer movie Ghost led Demi Moore. She's sitting there in Indiana. Then she leaves. She's like, no, you got to pay me more. She drops out of the film. That unravels everything. She was going to play the lead. So the Fox eventually hands the rock over to Columbia and director Penny Marshall. So I mentioned this because you think, okay, Penny Marshall, she should have directed League of Their Own. Yeah, she should have. But I'm just saying, like, they weren't necessarily thinking in the big studios when they were putting together big projects. They weren't thinking, let's get a member of that group. They didn't do that in any. And so I don't know. It's so fascinating to me that Spike Lee was doing this, negotiating in public. Any thoughts about that? I mean, have you ever done that? Have you ever negotiated in public by making a big stink on CNN, Sam, that you should be the one to do?
Well, no. And I mean, I don't have specific thoughts about that, although I think it connects to how the film was kind of treated.
Yes, it does. Eventually, I think Warner Brothers' resentment came out in several ways. And frankly, they stopped paying. Maybe I should get to that. Yeah. Well, okay. In that case, let me say, unlike Spike Lee, Warner Brothers was not about to negotiate in public. Some said the studio was waiting for the late August 1990 release of Mo Better Blues, Lee's first film after Do the Right Thing and First with Denzel Washington. Lee claims that Norman Jewison bowed out gracefully, partly because he was having difficulty with Fuller's script. Even as Warner Brothers cautiously took on Lee as director, the studio remained concerned that Lee was most enamored of the old Baldwin Pearl adaptation, which preserved so much of Malcolm's pre-prison criminal life. So this is the thing. It was always a tricky project because there was all this, I don't know what. There was his status as a prisoner, as a criminal. Then later there's the not exactly loving white people thing. Over the next 12 months, as Spike Lee was starting to work on it with Warner's, other African Americans also voiced concerns, including the estate of James Baldwin, who had died in '87. Baldwin's name came off the film. That's how that estate felt. Amiri Baraka led protests, including one of at least 200 people, where Baraka demanded to review the script to no avail. Proving that he could do some things privately, Spike Lee consulted with Francis Ford Coppola, who recommended that Lee, and this is the quote I read, get the movie pregnant, unquote, by moving along production so far that Warner's would have little choice but to go along with the budget. So that strategy, Sam, it worked until it didn't. Lee demanded 40 million. Warner's countered with 20 million. Spike managed to sell the foreign distribution rights to earn himself an extra 8.5. So now he's got about 28.5 to play with. September 1991, Sam, production begins. Spike, he's a prolific producer. He knows how to produce movies. He knows that the production expenses that he's going to rack up in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa are probably going to push the budget north of 30 million. So here's what he does, and we could this public thing, and during Lee's principal photography, his studio Warner Brothers releases its big Christmas Oscar contender for 1991, which is Oliver Stone's JFK. That movie boasts a $40 million budget, and it's a 3-hour running time. These are things Lee kept pointing out publicly to the press. He'd say, well, look, you can't tell me Malcolm X is less important than John Kennedy. If Oliver Stone's getting that, but the same studio, if the same studio is giving him 40, we're getting 40. The weird thing about him saying that is that JFK, the film, it's not exactly a biopic of Malcolm X in the same way. It is and it isn't. It's more about like chasing, you know what I'm saying. But that you can't say that to Spike Lee on TV, or you can, but you'll just get shouted down. Not shouted down. I don't mean it that way. I mean that Spike came on TV and said, no, we need more money. Warner's was not wild about any of this, especially they had their own issues because suddenly Oliver Stone was also on CNN, like defending the idea that there was like that something other than Lee Harvey Oswald's single bullet killed Kennedy. So they had all this controversy they were already dealing with. They didn't want to, so they certainly didn't want to negotiate more with Spike Lee in the middle of his production. So by mid-December, 91, JFK's coming out. Warner's says they stop. They stop the money train, Sam. They say, it's $4 million over even the agreed upon budget. It's like 32 million at that point. They say, we're not giving Spike Lee a dime more. If he ever finishes it, we'll distribute it, but we're stopping. So they hand it to a bond company, which is weird, Sam. Film companies don't usually do that. They do it for smaller films. But this was almost unprecedented. Lee paid the crew out of his own $3 million salary and other money he'd saved, but that more or less ran out by March of '92, with months of post-production editing still to go. At that point, Sam, Lee broke precedent again, reaching out to prominent Black entertainers. I sense that you knew I was going here, including Bill Cosby, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Oprah Winfrey, Stevie Wonder, Prince, Janet Jackson, Tracy Chapman. As Lee said to the press that summer, and I'm quoting Lee, "This is not a loan. They are not investing in the film. These are Black folks with some money who came to the rescue of the movie. As a result, this film will be my version, not the Bond Company's version, not Warner Brothers'. I will do the film the way it ought to be, and it will be over 3 hours," unquote. Thoughts about any of that? I guess it 30 years later, it's kind of like you just wonder what compromises all that meant exactly, or I don't know, or I do. What do you think of everything I just said, Sam? I know it's a big enchilada.
Well, all I can say about that is that it doesn't show, in my estimation. This is sort of getting into a slightly later topic about this, but I am dazzled by this movie.
Yeah.
I was dazzled by it when I saw it in the theaters, and watching it again now. I just think it's brilliant, and I think it's brilliantly made. And I don't think that I don't see, this is where they didn't have budget or anything. I don't see any of that.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely fair. Malcolm X begins with credits over Malcolm X describing democracy's hypocrisies over imagery of four white officers beating Rodney King and the US flag burning itself into an X. Under Boston's Dudley Street station during the war years, we're told, Zoot Suit sporting Shorty tips his shoe shine, Swagger strides into his barbershop and conks the teenage Malcolm Little, who jumps in pain, recovers, compliments his reddish straightened hair for looking white. Swagger strides alongside Shorty, and voiceovers about Klansmen terrorizing his childhood home in Nebraska. At the Roseland Club, Shorty and Malcolm, with many other hep cats, dance and get propositioned. Malcolm by white blonde Sophia. Malcolm blows off his black puritanical girlfriend, Laura, to meet Sophia, to make out with her in a car, and to make love to her later in her bedroom, where she kisses his foot as Malcolm asks, "So when are you going to holler rape, sister?" Unquote. On the beach with Laura, Malcolm flashes back to police declaring his father's murder a suicide, his mother losing the family to a state agency, his placement in a white detention home, his indifference to being called the N-word so often, and his mother falling apart. Adult Malcolm works as a white jacket waiter on a train that pulls into Harlem, where Malcolm celebrates Joe Lewis's hallowed glory with half of Harlem. In a bar, after Malcolm defeats a fight fomenter, West Indian Archie calls Malcolm over, observes his origins, offers him work, outfits him with garb and a gun, and shows him the ropes, including consuming copious courses of cocaine. In a club, after Archie keeps Malcolm from hitting a woman for no reason, he was about to hit her for no reason, I mean. Malcolm and Archie argue over whether Archie was asked to place a certain winning bet, and the fact that they can't agree leads to Archie approaching and threatening Malcolm as he sits by Sophia in a formal club listening to Billie Holiday, but Malcolm manages to make his escape through the men's room window. Shorty brings Malcolm back to Boston to introduce him to Rudy, who suggests robbing his client and claims to be the HNIC. So Malcolm humiliates him with a rigged round of Russian roulette, robs the place with Shorty and their two white girlfriends, gets a conk from Shorty the next day, and waits for Rudy only to see the police. Malcolm narrates that all four of them were first offenders, so the white women got the usual 2-year sentence, but since he and Shorty's real crime was sleeping with those white women, they received a minimum of 10 years of hard labor in February 1946. In prison, Malcolm Little resists, gets thrown into solitary, cries in darkness, finally showers, and gets a nutmeg-infused water from Baines, who begins showing Malcolm some non-con ropes, like discovering dictionary definitions of white, black, and every other word. On the prison ball yard, when the men celebrate Jackie Robinson joining the Dodgers, Baines blows off one bone, obviating 400 years of oppression of the original man as the camera pans over a bullpen full of proud, nodding black men. That's a fascinating shot, I thought. Baines pushes Malcolm to see Little as a slave name and to pray to Allah, a struggle through several scenes. But after Malcolm receives a righteous letter from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he prays, shaves his head, copies out the dictionary, and writes prostrating letters to Elijah Muhammad and proselytizing letters to Archie, Shorty, the mayor, the governor, and the president. In the prison chapel, Malcolm challenges the chaplain's conjecture that God is white. Out of prison, Malcolm stagger sobs into the office of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and we soon see Malcolm preaching on street corners, pulling black people away from churches, presuming to black women street meeting white women for nanny work, and finally pounding a meeting hall pulpit to a half-filled receptive audience as he paraphrases Cole Porter, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us." Malcolm sees Shorty in a back row, calls him an example of a slave mind, hugs him, takes him to coffee, and tries to convert him, but Shorty gives him no favor other than updates about their old gang, including Archie, whom Malcolm visits in a wretched apartment, finds to be strung out, and thanks for saving his life. To a now full meeting hall, Malcolm speaks of the many horrors that the white men visited on black men and especially black women, one of whom, Betty, afterward approaches and lunches with him, where Malcolm parrots Elijah Muhammad's mixed messages on women. Malcolm's awkward flirting gets interrupted by a man reporting the beating and jailing of one brother Johnson, on whose behalf Malcolm soon organizes dozens of methodically militant Muslims, convincing cops to allow Malcolm to see the grievously injured brother Johnson and call for both an ambulance and a much larger protest that rankles the police but raises Malcolm's profile. After an above-the-fold headline blares, "Malcolm X files $1 million suit," Elijah Muhammad privately tells Malcolm to serve as national minister, build temples all over the country, avoid the narcotic effect of cameras, and watch for the white devil. On a payphone call, Malcolm successfully proposes to Betty, who later tells him she wants him to have many children, just before their friends surround and cheer their matrimony. On a podium in Harlem Square before hundreds bearing signs reading, "We must have justice," Malcolm explains that the black man precedes and supersedes America. In an ample auditorium, he answers accusations of so-called black supremacy with advocations of black intelligence, black independence, black love, and black business ownership. Malcolm watches a hotel TV's images of Dr. King and fire-hosed, baton-beaten black men as his voiceover belittles black apologists for white betrayals, flanked by the dapperly dressed devout on a TV talk show at Harvard, and in front of a Citizen Kane-like mural-sized portrait of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm evangelizes white hypocrisy and black separation. In their apartment, Betty and Malcolm's first fight is about rumored adultery, Malcolm never being there for the kids and Baines backbiting. When Malcolm confronts Baines, he cites biblical sinners remembered for better deeds, but Malcolm quotes back to him Baines's prison sermon. When Elijah Muhammad privately confesses his own hypocrisy, Malcolm labels himself lost. But when President Kennedy is killed, Malcolm tells reporters that chickens have come home to roost, causing headlines that cause an ailing Elijah to forbid Malcolm to perorate or to press or pews for 90 days. After menacing phone calls, anonymous ones, an acolyte admits that he was told to rig a bomb in Malcolm's car, and we soon see Malcolm giving a press conference declaring his independence and attempt to mend fences with other black leaders. Malcolm visits the pyramids of Giza, Mecca, and other parts of the Arab world, feeling whole, voiceovering Islam as the cure to racism, praying in Arabic, and being tailed and bugged by whites. Back in the States, the firebombing of Malcolm's house reminds us of a similar incident from Malcolm's childhood. When reporters ask Malcolm about disarming black people, he parries to disarming whites. But to his lieutenant, Malcolm warns against bringing guns to an event at the Audubon Ballroom, to where we cut, hearing Junior Walker and the All-Stars shotgun. Seeing Harlem youth dancing and on sign anticipating Malcolm's appearance there on February 21st. We hear Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come as Malcolm X in close-up floats along a Harlem sidewalk on his way to the Audubon, where nothing seems to be going right other than his wife and kids in their usual front row seats. As Malcolm takes the podium, a man rises and blasts his chest with a gun. Two other men riddle Malcolm's body with bullets, and chaos reigns throughout the ballroom as Betty bawls and holds her husband's dying head. Dr. King is briefly seen, but the film is given over to Ossie Davis's extensive eulogy over stock footage of the actual Malcolm and evidence of his legacy. To a classroom of young students, Nelson Mandela, not an actor, but really Nelson Mandela, says, quote, "As Brother Malcolm said, we declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be given the rights of a human being, to be respected as a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence," unquote. And the film cuts to the real Malcolm saying, "by any means necessary," to cue credits rolling. Okay, now Sam, you have been very patient. It's not the shortest film I've ever seen. What stands out to you about this movie? What sort of is most unique, or what is the biggest takeaway here?
Well, I mean, one thing that stands out is of course Denzel Washington in it. Who?
Oh yeah.
I mean, the movie, I think, really charts his journey really remarkably well, but also just the transformation that he undergoes in that movie, in all the phases of Malcolm's life, is incredible. But also, I mean, this is not a surprise, to people who have been watching Denzel Washington in movies for decades, but like, he as Malcolm is such a compelling speaker. I mean, just riveting, just absolutely.
Yeah. You can't take your eyes off him, and you can't not listen to what he's saying either. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So it both really, I think, does. I mean, I don't know, how do you gauge doing justice to a historical figure, but like, I think it really brings to life like what was so magnetic about Malcolm X, but then also I think just in itself sets the stage for how the Nation of Islam people are thinking, this guy's getting way too big too fast. This guy's getting too much attention, because how could he not? I mean, he's incredible. But also it was interesting that in your summary, you talked about the musical choices, and I think the use of music in this movie, I mean, this isn't like the thing that I would single out most about the movie by any means, but it really was beautifully done, both in underscoring like great plot moments, but also just, the swing dancing scene in the,
Yeah,
early in the film, that paralleled by,
yeah.
the dancing going on to Shotgun during when everything's going to hell. I mean, it's really, yeah, it's just really masterfully done.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I agree with all that. Let me ask you a funny question. Like, I agree with you that Denzel Washington's performance is, I mean, it's staggering. It's one of the main reasons to watch this. What about, you know how the movie ends with footage of the actual Malcolm X? Like, we start rolling. It's during Ossie Davis's eulogy. It's actually before we see any credits. I guess I'm wondering, I have sort of mixed feelings about it. Does that take anything away from Denzel's performance to see the real Malcolm? Or, I mean, you tell me about how that filmic choice resonated with you. Was that just part of the love letter to Malcolm X? I mean, the real one. I don't know. You tell me how that worked for you.
Um, for me, it absolutely didn't undermine the performance. And I have seen other movies where they've done
Yes.
that, where it absolutely did, where it absolutely like, oh well, this guy's nothing like. But then when you see the real Malcolm and hear the real Malcolm, well, I guess you didn't hear so much, but because but a little bit, we heard. It really, I think, just did more credit to Denzel Washington's performance
Right.
as how thoroughly he inhabited this character. And I mean, great acting is not mimicry, but
Yeah.
but I felt like showing the real Malcolm, actually, whether or not this was the intent, really, yeah, just held up more what an incredible performance it was that Denzel Washington made.
Right. Wow. That's
I
a
should also say that eulogy by Ossie Davis, I mean, is the actual eulogy that Ossie Davis gave,
right.
when Malcolm X died. So
Right.
that in
That
itself
helps.
is
Yeah.
powerful.
Although I think he re-recorded just for the sound.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right. It is his eulogy that he actually had, but meaning that he showed up in the studio to just re-vocalize it just for technical reasons. But that's fair. But you're right, and that does mean something that was there. I'm a huge fan of the book. I know I'm not the only one. Lee made a lot of choices. I'll sell it. Here's what I'll say, Sam. Here's the thing I missed the most from adapting the book. If I had to single out one thing, in the book he names his sister Ella. In fact, I would say his sister Ella is in the book about 20 times more than Betty Shabazz. I mean, she's very present. She's almost like the main character after Malcolm. Like she walks him through his whole life in Boston. She's this great protector. She's also, he keeps describing her in the book as very, very black, like blacker than night. Actually, when I read the book back in the 80s, I had not ever seen a picture of her. Now it's easy to Google and see Google image. So I just did that before we got on this podcast. I said, well, what does she look like? I've never known other than reading Malcolm's description. Yeah, but she's pretty dark, sure. I remember going to the movie in 1992, Sam, and thinking to myself, wow, I wonder which really, really dark woman they're going to cast because there's so few. I can't wait to find out. Well, I get into the movie theater, Sam, and they cut the role. They cut that out of the. Now, granted, it's a long book. You do have to make some cuts. I get that totally, but I did miss that. I was sad that had happened. I was sad that the role of Ella, so crucial in the book, was gone. Any thoughts about that for you, Sam? The adaptation here? Anything that you felt like you would have done differently, or I don't know what, anything like that?
I have no thoughts about that whatsoever.
Okay.
The book is not at all fresh in my mind. No, I don't. I wasn't thinking about it.
Okay.
Except, as you say, you have to make some choices. So, like, I'll say that, but like,
yeah, I'm sure
choices. No, I don't have an opinion.
If Spike were here, I'd say he'd probably say, "Look, it's a 3-hour movie. You wanted a 4-hour movie or something." I mean, and I get that. I mean, I do see that it was already not a short film. I'm clear on that. It's funny. I had just alluded to this. Violence had been breaking out in movie theaters like in 1991, causing some black leaders. I didn't know about this. That I read all this stuff on the American Film Institute website. They're sourcing, the LA Times and reputable sources. There was like Boys in the Hood, New Jack City. There were violent incidents at theaters. So you had black leaders saying, these movies are bad. they were condemning a new era of black exploitation. I hear black leaders, including some from the NAACP. The organization was called Camera. I forgot what that stood for. I read it out last podcast. So there was a concern about Malcolm X in that same area. But but then what I found out is that it wasn't as big an issue. They did, in the case of this movie, it was not, Warner Brothers did pay for extra security, but it was fine. I wanted to mention that too, because it seems like that's part of the context, of this movie, was that people sometimes blame somebody like Spike Lee for like fomenting violence, which is silly. Like another part of the context is like George Holliday with the Rodney King video. He sued the production of Malcolm X because he said, you can't use my video, not because I don't want people to use it, but because I'm afraid that I'm going to get blamed if there's any violent riots in the cinema. And basically, what I read was that they came to an undisclosed settlement. I couldn't find the number, and I don't know. So, what do you think of that? It's weird to think about this today because we now don't think about that there were ever these tensions in the Black community about films, about about inciting violence. It's sort of an interesting. It's like reading these old articles. It's like a window to me into a world I had forgotten about. I mean, did you remember that was such a thing back then, Sam? That they were talking about it so much?
No, I don't remember that. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that there would be concern because obviously it's a provocative film, and it doesn't, it would not surprise anyone to say that it's a provocative film. It was going to be a provocative film and would have failed if it weren't. I mean, failed to be doing.
I knew what you meant. You're right.
Yeah, not thinking in terms of box office. I don't want to. I don't want to jump ahead if this is a whole different topic, but I'll just say,
why not?
To me, what I think of when I think of this movie is I think of the Oscars. I think, and this was nominated for 2 Academy Awards.
Oh God, that's
one for Denzel Washington and one for costumes.
Right? Oh my God! Wow, that's it. Oh.
Nothing for Best Picture. Certainly nothing for Spike Lee. And that in itself felt to me just punitive. Like
yes,
like you talk about snubs, things being overlooked, and I feel like that conversation is often, I think people are too quick to cry snub about their favorite movie.
Yeah.
But my God, this was, for somebody whose body of work was already pretty terrific, this was just such a, this was such a, like, I feel masterpiece. I had quibbles about this and that, but like, my God, it was such an ambitious and such a successfully ambitious work that like not even nominating Spike Lee as director for it was just ridiculous. But then also, we talked about how incredible Denzel Washington's performance was. And he did not win that Academy Award, but who did win it was Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman. And it was just one of those things where like, oh, how has Al Pacino not gotten an Academy Award? Let's give him one for this honestly pretty cartoonish.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and also I wasn't going to throw any particular movie under the bus, but Scent of a Woman got the Best Picture nomination that I think Malcolm X should have and could have gotten. I'm sorry, Scent of a Woman is okay, fine. I get what it is, but does that really rise to the level of what we should expect out of a Best Picture? I don't. Well, not for me, but yeah, and I agree. Pacino was overdue. The fact that Denzel had won an Oscar 3 years before, I'm sure, played on their minds. They like parity. But I still don't. But agreed, this should have been undeniable. This should have been undeniable on the Tom Hanks like 2 consecutive Oscars level. There's sometimes you just have to break your parity rule, and they should have, and I don't. And I do. You know what? I think you really pointed to something accurate where there was something punitive. I don't think they loved all the negotiating in public. And not that, the other studios, on one level, they probably liked seeing Warner Brothers squirm. On another level, they thought, you know what, we don't want that to happen to us next time. And we think like if we get caught up in like publicly negotiating over salaries and like JFK was this much, so you have to give me this much. They don't want that to, I do think they probably thought Spike Lee was a little, I'm not. I mean, words are coming to my mind, Sam, with some racial connotations like uppity. I probably shouldn't say them out loud, but I'm just saying that it wouldn't surprise me if to learn that studios were thinking. Some of those AMPAS voters were probably thinking that too. I mean, I don't
Well,
know.
honestly, I mean, even without thinking about all the like, I was going to say behind the scenes things going on, but they weren't even behind the scenes because they were being played out in public. But
Right.
even without thinking about that, I think between Spike Lee, Spike Lee being Spike Lee
Yeah.
and being very, very much and very publicly Spike Lee, and
Yeah.
then also the content of the movie. I mean, there are so many
Oh,
reasons
right.
why it could have just pissed the Academy off.
Yes.
To like, let's just, let's leave him out of this entirely.
Right.
Um, you know, and then yeah, with then bringing that stuff back in. I mean, it just felt like a slap in the. It just looked like a slap in the face.
I totally agree. I consider Malcolm X a great film, up there with the great biopics like Lawrence of Arabia. I think. I mean, to me, it's up there. If I have a little problem with the film, and this isn't about Ella, it feels like the kind of film that the family probably would have approved. I think we see that with different biopics, that you see other ones where you're like, wow, okay, they clearly didn't get the family's approval in this case. I don't think when you're watching this movie, it doesn't feel like Betty Shabazz would be taking out an op-ed in the New York Times to say how this movie lied about this and that. I mean, and I guess I have mixed feelings about that. I think on the one level, we needed this movie desperately. So, okay, fair. But sometimes I guess I sometimes like a biopic that seems a little less reverent, if you will. I don't know if you had that thought at all, Sam.
Sure. I mean, there's lines here and there where I notice. I don't. It doesn't even necessarily bother me, but like I notice. The thing where the FBI people um, listening in comment to each other, like, compared to MLK, this guy's a monk. It's like,
Yes.
okay, I don't begrudge them that line, but it did sort of feel like a little tiny bit over the top, but it's fine.
Right.
By that point, they could do whatever they want in that movie. By that point, and I'd be like, you know what, do what you want to do. And I feel like the ending of the movie kind of capitalizes on that. With the I am Malcolm X, I am Malcolm X. Like, I the first time I saw it, that struck me as a little, like, what are we doing now? The movie's over, but it's still going. But knowing that it's there and anticipating that on this rewatch, I was totally on board with it.
Yeah. I was going to mention that when Spike Lee made this film, part of the context was the recent adoption of Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday. Martin Luther King had sort of become the accepted secular saint. To remind people of Malcolm was to also remind them that Martin Luther King's saintly, nonviolent approach wasn't the only possible way to be a Black hero, right? I think that's an important part of the context. And Spike Lee knew that. His ending of Do the Right Thing had those quotes from both King and Malcolm, right? The latter naming self-defense type violence as intelligence. I love that it did that. I love that ending. I love this film. I think a thing. Let me ask you about this one, Sam, which really struck me while I was watching this. 30 years later, we're now past 30 years of like Do the Right Thing. MLK and Malcolm, they sort of remain these like singular figures of like Black life and Black identity. They don't just happen every 20 or 30 years or something. Someone like Al Sharpton is not the new MLK or Malcolm. There isn't one. Just in the same way that the Beatles don't just happen to come along. You could name some new band but they're not the new Beatles. I'm sorry, they just aren't. And there's something about the singularity of Malcolm and King in our lives that just, I don't know, I may not even have a question here, except that do you agree that they're sort of singular figures? I mean, and there's a tragedy to me about that. I want there to be more figures like this, I guess, or more women figures like this, and I can see that there are not. I mean, and that gets me a little bit. I guess I don't know. I may not have a question here. I just, it's something that was reverberating through my mind while I was watching this. Any other thoughts that were reverberating through yours?
No, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of bases here.
Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. In that case, I will say that in winter 1991 to 92, Oliver Stone probably did about 100 press interviews about the film JFK and that film's notion that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone when he was assassinating the president. Okay, now, in none of those interviews, as far as I could tell, did Oliver Stone address the issue of Spike Lee's invidious comparisons of their two films. However, Stone had followed Lee's unlikely efforts on behalf of an underrepresented community's stories being told by a more appropriate director. Arguably, Stone had himself been such a director in the world of films about wars after World War II. When Oliver Stone's Platoon came out in 1986, this narrative of Stone as the first Vietnam veteran to make a Vietnam film certainly helped Platoon win Best Picture and Stone Best Director. Couple of things we just talked to, that you just mentioned. By the time Stone won his second Best Director Oscar 3 years later, he's just picking these things up while Spike Lee's hanging out, not getting nominated. For Born on the 4th of July, critics had noticed that Oliver Stone's Asian set stories, they didn't grant Asians a lot of agency. That was something critics were kind of making more noise about. Now, even as Stone prepared his response film, which was a movie called Heaven and Earth, which would give at least a little more agency, not as much as he could have, he also looked around for something that might better represent what was obviously a very underrepresented Asian American community. So Stone reached out to Wayne Wang, whom I profiled on my podcast about Chan is Missing, and who had followed up that film with Dim Sum, A Little Bit of Heart, and in 1989, Eat a Bowl of Tea. As it happened, Wang did have an idea for Stone, based on having introduced himself to author Amy Tan shortly after the somewhat sensational 1989 release of her novel, The Joy Luck Club. Compared to other filmic suitors, Amy Tan appreciated Wang's uncertainty of his own abilities to deliver the epic sweep that he felt that an adaptation of her book would deserve. Oliver Stone knew epics. He was kind of famous for them. But he felt sure that Wang should direct the film, and he liked Tan's enthusiasm for writing the screenplay. But knowing how novelists usually adapt their own work, he asked her if she wouldn't mind a more experienced writing partner to help her hammer out the screenplay. Stone himself had won an Oscar for writing Midnight Express, but he connected Tan and Wang to a more recent winner of the Best Original Screenplay, Mr. Ron Bass. Now, it's funny because I actually do think, Sam, that Ron Bass deserves a minor footnote in this master list of movie milestones of the marginalized, which is weird because I don't always say this about a white guy screenwriter, but let me say what he did. He went to Harvard Law School in the 60s. He moved into entertainment law. He rose to partner by the 80s, and then he left to pursue his dream of writing novels and screenplays. After fits and starts, Bass's Oscar-winning script for Rain Man turned him into one of Hollywood's most sought-after and prolific wordsmiths, often working uncredited, probably on like 100 films of the 90s. Unlike many of these white guys that I just mentioned, Bass maintained an interest in the marginalized. Some of his most famous scripts of the 90s are Sleeping with the Enemy, The Joy Luck Club, When a Man Loves a Woman, starring Andy Garcia, Waiting to Exhale, Dangerous Minds, How Stella Got Her Groove Back, and Snow Falling on Cedars. Though Bass didn't write Philadelphia, he might have almost written that line that its lead character Andy says on the witness stand, that his favorite part of the law is justice being done, and quote, that really is quite a thrill when that happens, unquote. For The Joy Luck Club, Bass was credited with the voiceovers and the idea of a farewell party for June. Ron Bass and Amy Tan's script for The Joy Luck Club did not stimulate much studio interest, Sam. No Hollywood film had ever starred 8 women of color, which is related to the reason that the film couldn't star, I don't know, what do you call them, stars? Carolco had a deal to make The Joy Luck Club. They went bankrupt. After those 100 JFK interviews, Oliver Stone was now ready to switch gears. He brought The Joy Luck Club over to Disney in early '92, but in this case, doing business as Hollywood Pictures. They agreed, Katzenberg agreed to produce and distribute the film for about $10 million. The principals were working far beneath their usual rate, but the lead women were happy to be working, for once, on a project that was not far beneath their dignity. Of the 60 roles, about 50 were played by women, about 30 were played by Mandarin-speaking actors. That's a heck of a statistic for an American film, Sam. Wang and Tan encouraged the cast to bond by arranging large dinners after rehearsals. Wayne Wang and Amy Tan arranged for production designer Donald Graham to visit many Chinese American houses in San Francisco to grasp the kind of the typical hybridized designs and what people would leave around their house. Production began in November 1992 in San Francisco, lasted for 10 weeks, and then moved to China for 6 difficult weeks. As with Malcolm X, by the time the Joy Luck Club's production team went abroad, the film was, to use Coppola's term, too pregnant not to finish. Okay, any thoughts about anything I just said about the pre-production before I ask you like what you thought of the finished film?
Um, not specific to how the film was made, but I did see one interesting thing when I was just sort of looking at one interesting thing on like the Wikipedia page of
Sure, that's fine.
of
I go there
the film,
too. Yeah, to start.
um,
Yeah.
where it just kind of parroted a claim that this was like the only the second Hollywood movie with an Asian American story and predominantly Asian cast. And I thought, like, I don't necessarily think of it's the Hollywood thing that I wasn't necessarily thinking of at the time,
Sure.
because I don't necessarily make a distinction between like what's a big picture and what's a little picture. And so
Sure.
I think, even with, yeah, you look at the director's body of work himself. I mean, I know that you've covered some of this before. I mean, you just look at Wayne Wang's movies and you can think, okay, well, here's some counter examples right there.
Right. Yeah.
But what it was saying is, in terms of major
Yes.
movies
Studio finance.
with an Asian American story and a predominantly Asian cast, you had
Flower Drum Song, I think, is the
right. You had Flower Drum
it.
Song.
That's it.
Then
the second.
decades later, you had Joy Luck Club, and then decades later again, you had Crazy Rich Asians.
25 years later. So in other words, right, there were two up until 3 years ago ish.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, that's a problem. I know that not everybody lives like we do in California, and not everybody sees as many Asians regularly as we do. It's still a problem. It's a huge problem. I mean, this is the largest continent in the world, like half the world's people live there. We need some of them dash Americans in movies here, and more than just in like one role as the computer programmer or something. I mean, that's not enough, I mean, yeah, it's
and again, it's not saying all movies. I mean, I was thinking like, well, I mean, just before Crazy Rich Asians came out, I watched, Always Be My Maybe, which also fits that description, except it's not a big movie, it didn't.
It's not, yeah, right. I think that may not have been studio financed. I mean, because like a movie like Minari, I think, well, did that have? I think that, okay, I don't know depending on the financing, because sometimes they come in later to distribute. In this case,
the business side of it is not my.
No, I know, and you're right. If you look at Eat a Bowl of Tea, you'd think, okay, that was probably just a studio, but it compared to Joy Luck Club, Disney was in early. I mean, Disney literally paid for everything. Well, DBA Hollywood Pictures, so that's different. We call that a studio finance film. The Joy Luck Club begins in dark credits as June tells the parable of the duck that stretched its neck, became a swan, and was brought to America by a hopeful Chinese woman, only to see the swan reduced to a feather that yet symbolizes immigrant hopes. At a Chinese American party at Su Yuan's San Francisco apartment, June reluctantly poses for a photo with her late mother's friends and their daughters, and takes a mahjong seat with Lindo, Ying Ying, and Anmei, who, she says, her mother joined with her to make the Joy Luck Club. June flashes back to her childhood as a poor piano player, outed at a recital, and rebelliously spouting she wished her mother had left her by the side of the road like she did those babies. A scene we see as Su Wan, on a wartime march to Chungking, places her twin babies next to a tree. In Golden Gate Park, next to another tree in the present, Lindo presents June with a letter from the former babies, although later at Mahjong, when June steps out, Ying Ying and Anmei lambast Lindo for lying to June and lying to the twins that Su Wan is still alive. Lindo flashes back to her girlhood in China, where she is raised traditionally to the point of meeting, as a 15-year-old bride, her husband, who laughs at Lindo and sleeps with her only as brother and sister. Older women hit teenage Lindo for not making babies until Lindo hits upon the idea of crying to the god ancestor and claiming that the god showed her that her husband made another girl pregnant, whom the matchmaker had greedily ignored, fooling the other women long enough to get a ticket to Shanghai and eventually America. As Lindo meets her daughter Waverly in a beauty shop, Waverly flashes back to her childhood as a chess champion, where her mother, showing off her daughter's life cover, prompts Waverly to rebel at her mother, escalating to the point of Lindo denouncing her daughter, which makes her, meaning Waverly, lose her composure, confidence, and chess-playing skills. In more recent times, Waverly brings Lindo to her panorama view apartment with her white fiancé Rich, whose gifts Lindo finds fault with. And then Waverly brings Rich to dinner at her mother's, where Rich makes several cultural gaffes, leading up to seeing Lindo's prime dish and saturating it with soy sauce. In a symbolic shot, Lindo and Waverly together see themselves in the beauty shop mirror as Waverly cryingly admits Lindo's power over her, and they somewhat reconcile. Ying Ying flashes back to her young adulthood in a more cosmopolitan part of China and her whirlwind romance with tall, handsome Western suit wearing Lin Chao, who marries her, makes her pregnant, sleeps around on her, and returns to slap her around, cueing her to, quote, take from him the one thing, unquote, she could. Although the little bath drowning of her baby is filmed as though it might be accidental, in San Francisco, middle aged Ying Ying voiceovers that she never explained this trauma to Lena, which made Lena grow up without a spirit, as we see in Lena's present in the spacious, gray, antiseptic modern house she shares with her Chinese boss and husband, Harold, who itemizes their expenses, splits everything exactly in half, but also forces them to keep a symbolic lopsided table where, as Ying Ying puts it, one more thing will cause it to collapse. When Lena admits to Ying Ying he doesn't give her tenderness or respect, she flashes back on Lin Chao as she advises Lena to leave until she gets those things. And we see Lena at June's party, happy with a new man. Anmei flashes back to China, where she, at the age of 9, is being raised by her grandmother, who becomes sick, prompting the arrival of Anmei's exiled mom, who cuts open her flesh to help heal her mother, then grabs some of her flesh, or really her daughter, to relocate. In the present, Anmei's daughter Rose meets newspaper empire heir Ted in college, impresses him, and at a Tony garden party meets Ted's aristocratic mom, who asks her to understand that Ted will be meeting important clients, and Vietnam was so unpopular. But Ted interrupts, calls his mother an asshole, and tells Rose, we're out of here. Rose walks us through loving being rescued, getting married, making Ted grow bored of her, trying harder, having a baby to save the marriage, him cheating on her, and them dividing assets, prompting Anmei to say to Rose, that Rose, like her own mother, never learned her own worth until it was too late. Anmei flashes us back to China, where her 9-year-old self joins her mother's new house, learns of her humiliating life as Wu Xing's fourth wife, steals a pearl necklace from Wu Xing's beloved second wife, who provided his only son, and watches her mother shatter the balls to show that what she prized so much was only glass. Anmei's mother tells Anmei she was the daughter of a first wife, Anmei. But when her husband died, Wu Xing raped her. Her family failed to believe her. She reluctantly became a fourth wife, and yet second wife claimed that male child as her own. In the same flashback, Anmei's mother consumes copious opium to commit suicide on a carefully chosen day that curses Wu Xing. In the present, in a rainy yard, Rose rejects Ted touching her daughter or house or knowledge of herself, saying, quote, I died 60 years ago. I ate opium and I died for my daughter's sake. Now get out of my house, unquote. However, Rose also says that much of this wasn't Ted's fault. And we return to June's party, where we see Ted for the first time, clearly with Rose and enjoying the cake she made. June flashes back to a year ago dinner where Waverly describes June's ad copywriting work for her, Waverly's, prestigious firm as unacceptable, and Su Yuan supports Waverly, claiming she has a style that can't be taught. Later, June confronts her mother's expectations to hear her say, quote, never expect, only hope, unquote, but June says it hurts. Su Yuan says, I see you. I see you. Holds her face in her hands, gives her a treasured necklace keepsake, prefers June's heart to Waverly's, and says June has a style that can't be taught. June thanks everyone at the party, especially Lindo, but later Lindo confesses she lied to the twins and is leaving it to June to tell them their mother is dead. In the final flashback, June's father explains that in wartime China, on that trail to Chongqing, Su Yuan thought she was dying when she left her babies, a note with instructions on how to get their father, and all her possessions by that tree, because she knew no one would adopt babies with a ghost mother following them around. But as Su Yuan staggered away, a truck picked her up and she awoke in a hospital wanting to die. June's father hands June the swan feather with the explanation that Su Yuan never felt herself worthy to give it to June because all of her hopes lay with June, and a mother can never give up hopes for her child. June gets off a boat in China, holds the swan feather, meets the twins, admits their mother is dead, said she was hoping to take their mother's place. and pulls them into a surprising hug as the camera pans up to hear June narrating, quote, "It was enough for them and for me because really she was there and I'd finally done something for her. I found the best of myself, what she kept for all of us, her long cherished wish," unquote. Sam, what did you think of this movie?
Um, well, I mean, I like it a lot. It's there's so many things about it that's like, you've got this great story, and the framing sequence with the going away party that's not originally in the book. I mean, it's fine. It draws things together. I'm not crazy about is it Rachel Portman who did the soundtrack? I'm not crazy
Yeah,
about it.
sounds right. Yeah, it's okay.
It's fine.
Go ahead.
There's the music's a little sentimental for my taste, but it's fine. There are things that I find it interesting that it's a San Francisco movie that I like set in San Francisco, and I believe filmed in San Francisco.
Yeah, it was actually, yes.
But that at no point made me think like, oh, there's that place I recognize or that place I recognize, because so much of it was like in rooms and
Yes, that's right.
The places that are exteriors are places, rich places to which I'm not invited. So like yeah, so that was interesting to me. Also, just as a seeing Ming Na Wen in it was also interesting, because I'm so used to now seeing her as this like hard ass action hero in her 50s from Agents of Shield and The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. Like going back and seeing her like all baby faced and playing this kind of wishy washy character in this film is really disorienting. I know that for plenty of people, like she was on other popular shows for years and they kind of watch that progression, but like for me, it's like whoa, it's very jarring. And it's funny, I say baby face, but she was like 30 when she made this movie. It's not like she was but she's playing,
I hear you. No, I get it. Yeah. Yeah, I teach this movie, or I have. At Diablo Valley College, we would read the book and then we would watch the movie and we would talk about adaptation, like what should they have kept in, not kept in, what Wayne Wang might have done differently. I mean, I don't know. Is there any big thing sticking out to you, Sam, where you're like, damn, they really screwed this up. There was something they should have had.
I don't know. I mean, again, I'm sort of on the fence about the framing sequence. Like it's fine. It brings things together. It's a choice. It's it's again a little sentimental for me, but like it's fine. And there are certainly other ways of doing it. Like in the book, the book is basically these interlaced short stories or vignettes or whatever you want to call them. And you could easily do like what's done in the book with like have a title. Here's a chapter. Like, you could do that, made a different choice. It's fine, but the cast is incredible. I love that it's a movie. I love that it's a movie with all of these centered around all of these women, the daughters, the mothers, and telling all of these amazing stories of these very, very different stories of these very different women and their, not just like their stories as immigrant women and as first generations of Americans, although certainly is that, but also just, it's about that. And it's also about their relationships with each other and about their relationships with these often awful men. Not always, some of them are great, but it just does so much in one movie as the book also does so much. And I just think it's a good movie.
I have to admit, I'm kind of a huge fan of this movie. I kind of love it. I mean, I guess I don't claim it to be perfect, but I'm really into it. For me, this is another one that should have been a Best Picture nominee and wasn't. But one question we sometimes talk about in the class is this movie or is Amy Tan's story like trying to say that, I mean, what is exactly the posited relationship with like China and America? Do these four mothers, do they regret having moved from from China, are they happy that they brought their daughters here? Are they thinking their daughters are ungrateful and don't appreciate them and they wish they were daughters were growing up in China? Or are they, or is it more like they know that their daughters are better off than they are, but they can't help themselves and think, wow, they have it too easy? I mean, I don't know. Like, and then I guess I just don't know if we know what the movie is saying about China. China and America. I mean, I don't know if it's trying to, if these women are saying, wow, China was horrible, women were concubines, marriages were arranged, or maybe it's a little more nuanced than that. Maybe it's more like, there were some good things. I don't know. I mean, do you feel like there's a message, a takeaway about this?
Yeah.
Just go ahead.
I mean, I think it's a lot more nuanced, but also, like, I don't get the impression that these women overall regret coming to America or regret raising their daughters in America. Do they think that their daughters are ungrateful? Largely, yes, but not necessarily because they're American. But although certainly there's an undercurrent. You've got people fleeing like in some incredibly terrible conditions. I mean, some of these stories from back in China are incredibly grueling and terrible, and it's not because it's China. It's because, like, there were all, some of it is cultural, some of it's historical, some of it's you've got people. It's funny, it doesn't really talk that much about, like, the people who are fleeing the Japanese invasion that they were, like, interestingly, it doesn't
label the Japanese as bad guys the way it kind of could. It almost makes you wonder if they, like, I don't know, didn't want to do that for whatever reason. Yeah.
Well, also, I don't remember there being, even in the scenes where people are, fleeing their homes, being devastated, and I don't remember there actually being any Japanese characters in the book.
No,
even as, like, rude soldier or anything like that. So they're kind of treated as, like, a catastrophic force of nature, and I feel like that's reflected in the movie, but perhaps slightly, it would be easy to miss it. Like, it would be easy to miss, like, what the hell are they even fleeing?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, yeah, and you're right, and there aren't necessarily any Japanese American characters in the movie, although I wondered about, I mean, I'm probably going to regret saying this on a recorded thing, but it's so quick, it's a blink and you'll miss it. But, like, so two of the daughters are dating white men, right? The narrating daughter, June, is not dating anybody. The other daughter, the one who's paid the least attention, Lena, her story is the quickest of everybody's, right? It's that she lives with the Asian guy who's sort of anal about, keeping their itemizing their expenses. She has the shortest, pretty sure it's the shortest amount of screen time. And then when we come back to her at the present at the party, she's dating she's the only one of the daughters to be dating an Asian American man. I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this. He looked a little bit Japanese to me, but he didn't get a close up. I didn't get a good look at him. I wanted to look more. I was actually really interested, because that would be its own kind of statement if the film was saying, the daughters basically don't, like, date, or like, this newer generation is not dating Chinese American men. That it's only other kinds, and I that would be. I don't know if that's what. Did you notice what I'm talking about at all?
I did not notice in terms of ethnicity. What I did notice was that, in addition to being, like, terribly controlling is putting it too strongly, but it being very oppressive to her. However,
yes,
however much that's him intending to do it. I don't think he was intending to do it, but her husband was also kind of nebbishy, and then she winds up dating this punk. That's what I got.
Yeah, he looks kind of suave, and he looks like the cool guy you hang out with at the club. I mean, all of a sudden, now that could,
and also nice. He seemed nice. He seemed like a step up in any number of ways.
I wanted to hear more he's on screen like this, and you'll miss it. Compared to, like, Rich and Ted, the two white boyfriends / husbands, they have much more screen time. You get to know them, one way.
Sure. And those things that they didn't get into or couldn't get into.
Of course, you have to elide some things. I mean, how can
the stories from the book that aren't even touched on in the
yeah.
I think, and I seem to remember that in the book, like one of the daughters was like had a white dad or something. And like we don't get it. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. No, I know. There's all kinds of stuff that's elided. Ying Ying's story is really elided the Lena's mom. I mean, other than her drowning the baby, there's all this other stuff, But yeah, I mean, it unlike Spike Lee, they weren't going to do a 3 hour thing. They were doing 2 hours and change, right? And yeah, of course you're going to reduce that story somewhat. I think for what they kept, I kind of love it, and I guess what I want to say, Sam, is that for me, it's not just like a milestone movie that I'm being told to love, so I love it. I love it. I don't know. I think this is great. I mean, much like Malcolm X, I'm like, wow, this is I don't see why this movie isn't on more top 100 lists anyway, if you will. When you go to like the most popular film sites like IMDb or Letterboxd or Rotten Tomatoes or whatever, and you look at their top 100s or top 200s, to me, Joy Luck Club and Malcolm X should be on a lot more of those and aren't. That's one reason I'm doing this podcast at all. Okay. Any other thoughts about Joy Luck Club before I start my transition?
nope.
Okay, well, great. When Spike Lee insisted on a director of color for a premium budget film about that director's community, he blazed a trail that hundreds of directors would later walk through. When Oliver Stone hired the Wayne Wang Amy Tan team, he enabled what was basically the first mainstream film entirely focused on women of color. But in a way, what Jonathan Demme did for today's next film was almost more impressive than either of those accomplishments. So let me explain what I mean by that. In 1988, Alice Hoffman wrote a novel called At Risk about a young woman who contracts AIDS through a blood transfusion, and Orion Pictures and Jonathan Demme announced that they would take the risk of adapting Hoffman's novel into Hollywood's first film about AIDS. Demme brought the novel to his collaborator on 1984 Swing Shift, namely Ron Neiswaner, who was interested partly because his nephew had AIDS. Perhaps I should say that AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. I don't know. I thought maybe everybody knows that. In early 1991, Demme's film, The Silence of the Lambs, premiered, became a smash hit, and as Yvonne Tasker shows in her book about the film, it incensed the nascent LGBTQ community, which wasn't a huge community then, or not very visible or vocal, not like they would be later. They weren't thrilled with this film, to the point of protests in the street because of the film's queer villain. No, not Hannibal Lecter, the other one, Buffalo Bill. After that experience, Demme was still planning to adapt At Risk, this movie about a straight hemophiliac woman, straight, not gay woman who contracted AIDS basically through no fault of her. And he was starting to wonder now, after everything that had happened with Silence of the Lambs, if an AIDS movie without a gay lead might be something of a cop-out. So Demme asked Neiswaner to circle back to these news clippings that they had seen about two lawyers. They were already, doing a legal movie. There were these two lawyers, Sam, Jeffrey Bowers and Clarence Kane. They were gay men. They had AIDS. They'd been fired. They'd sued for wrongful termination. In a way, Demme and Neiswaner were lucky that they knew of two separate, distinct cases, not just one, because in theory, neither family could sue. Although Bowers' family did anyway, securing one of those undisclosed settlements I've been talking about, and the defense's admission that the film was inspired in part by Bowers' story. But here's the thing, Sam, it wasn't a slam dunk, and this is what's impressive to me. By early 1992, there was still no guarantee that any studio would make anything like Bowers's or Kane's story. I mean, studios weren't chomping at the bit to be like, let's be the first studio to make this movie about a gay lead with AIDS, right? They weren't. By the way, there were other movies. I'm going to get to them, like Longtime Companion, but I'm just saying this: they weren't. All the 7 big studios weren't rushing to make this movie. Not least because the studio that Demme was working with, Orion, went, like Carolco, went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy at this time. Then, Sam, this is the turn. This is such an important moment to me. As pro-LGBTQ protesters stood outside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, inside, in March 92, The Silence of the Lambs became the third and so far last film to sweep the Oscars, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay for Ted Talley, not Neiswaner, Best Actor, and Best Actress. Suddenly, Sam, Jonathan Demme had the closest Hollywood ever comes to a blank check. So what did he do with that blank check? Well, Demme felt sorry that he had hurt the feelings of his gay friends. So working with Neiswaner, Demme radically changed their AIDS script, renamed it Probable Cause, and got the project revived at TriStar Pictures. Casting would be crucial. Demme knew this, especially because he had spent a year in pre-production on Silence of the Lambs, insisting that Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter be played by Michelle Pfeiffer and Sean Connery. Okay. Technically, anyone of any age might have played Andy Beckett or Joe Miller, although there was an elegance in having them be around the same age, and younger was better because it implied that the twin tragedies of AIDS and homophobia didn't only happen to the older generation. Demme and Niswander had basically written a Frank Capra movie. Maybe we can talk more about that. They needed to cast as Capra's generation had done. Their ideal actors for Andy and Joe would be under 40, immensely talented, handsome, and to borrow the title of Demme's next movie, beloved. The bigger the stars, the clearer the film's message against gay hatred. That was the way they did it back in Capra's day, you know? So casting an actually out gay actor like Ian McKellen, who was nowhere near the A-list in 91 or 92, that didn't even get, I mean, because people, I know some of my fans or friends are going to later say, why didn't they cast a gay person as Andy Beckett? Right, I get that. It didn't even get to the contract paperwork stage. Not even, it wasn't even on their radar. Who was on their radar instead? Well, Andy Garcia and Daniel Day-Lewis both came very close to playing Andrew Beckett, but they both had other commitments that seemed more interested in them after Demme very truly nearly cast each of them separately. Then, and this is a surprise to me too, I know I seem to keep bringing up this movie, I bet you weren't expecting this. In July 1992, A League of Their Own came out to Boffo box office, re-verifying Tom Hanks' stature as having all those old school star qualities that I just mentioned. But he had something else that Hanks would later joke about when he was on camera making the movie, the documentary, The Celluloid Closet. In that thing, he calls himself, I'm little Tommy Hanks, the least scary person in Hollywood, perfect for demystifying and demonsterizing the purportedly promiscuous gay boogeyman. When production began in October 92, Demme mostly shot in chronological order to help both Hanks' acting and his weight loss. Hanks would lose about 35 pounds by the end of the shoot. As a title, Probable Cause started to sound a little limited to legal thrillers. During principal photography, when they changed it to People Like Us, rumor had it that someone had misheard Probable Cause and Demme liked the mishearing. I love that slight anecdote, whether it's true or not. Now, I'm trying to wind up to what I think Demme did that was so important. As for the role of Joe Miller, TriStar seriously considered Robin Williams, Bill Murray, William Hurt, Nick Nolte, and Tim Robbins. Jonathan Demme approached Denzel Washington in the manner that I described Mira Nair approaching him on the last podcast, not just as an actor for hire, but as a collaborator who would have veto power over any and all aspects of the film's African-American culture as presented in. This was around the same time that Warner's was negotiating with Washington to star in another legal thriller, The Pelican Brief, based on a John Grisham novel whose lead characters were very obviously white. Washington well understood the mixed compliment of being offered roles originally written as white, but he and Jonathan Demme agreed that the AIDS script would offer a chance to say more than John Grisham had said about Black people. Sam, anyone listening to hip hop in the early 90s had some idea of what we might kindly call the uneasy relationship between the Black community and the gay community. Washington got Demme to promise him that he wouldn't cut the scene where Joe's wife, his Black wife, Lisa, would list her many gay friends. And he also promised he wouldn't cut the scene where the white bartender happily hails Joe's homophobia. Now titled Philadelphia, the film also made regular reference to disability in the context of common cause amongst the marginalized, a theme and a practice that would only become normal in Hollywood decades later. Demme cast, this is the famous thing I bet you were going to mention if I hadn't. Demme cast as extras at least 50 people diagnosed with AIDS. 5 years later, less than 10 of those people remained alive. That is a crazy thing to even think about. Demme's outreach to outgroups included his DP, Tak Fujimoto, as well as asking John Leguizamo to play Andy's boyfriend. When Leguizamo said no, Demme turned to Antonio Banderas, who was basically unknown in the US. He'd only been in Almodovar movies that anybody had seen here. Here's the thing that I just want to say, and this is so important to me to say as a film historian. Generally, when white straight directors have been criticized by women or a particular ethnic group, generally they lash out. They claim they were misunderstood. They go to safer filmic territory. They go back to whatever their white community is that they grew up with. But Oliver Stone, and then to this larger degree, Jonathan Demme, to me, they modeled like the post-Lambast pivot. You know, basically Demme had this one blank check. You get this once in your life. You make a Silence of the Lambs once in your life. You're not going to get this blank check again. What did he do with it? He said, you know what, community, you were right. I screwed up. Here's this. And I just think that's so, I just love that. I think even if you hate Philadelphia as a film, I don't I actually kind of love it, but I'm saying if only every director criticized by a marginalized community would, every white guy director would say, you know what? Yes, you're right. Let me do this instead. This to me, it's a model of behavior. That's all. Thoughts about anything I just said?
Oh gosh. Well, it's funny you mentioned the casting in it and the casting of people at the party and all this stuff. I also, I mean, I love the casting in this movie just throughout. I love that, I love that you have Anna Devere Smith in it.
Yes.
I love that his doctor is played by Karen Finley at kind of the height of her notoriety. I mean, she had several heights of her notoriety.
No, but still, right. Yeah.
It's
great casting. It helped that he had just made The Silence of the Lambs. It did. I mean, at that point, who's hanging up the phone on you at that point? But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on this movie that could kind of come in at any point in this discussion. So,
well, okay. So now the summary. Philadelphia begins with a loving, thorough montage to its title location that ends in a judge's chamber, where two attorneys argue about the toxicity of a construction site's soil sample. But Andrew Beckett prevails over Joe Miller and shares with him an elevator whose doors close, revealing a scrawled, "No justice, no peace." Andy visits the doctor, arrives late at his white shoe legal firm, phones his mom to report his good blood results, works past 10 p.m., and gets called upstairs into a room of tuxedo-clad cigar-smoking partners led by Charlie Wheeler, who quizzes Andy about Highline's current copyright case, likes his answer, and announces Andy's promotion to senior associate to huzzas and hearty handshakes, and Andy hiding a hairline lesion. 9 days later, in a loft of friends, Andy submits Highline work by fax and submits himself to makeup work to blotch out the blemishes, but begins to be sick and begs for the hospital. Miguel runs there, briefly kisses Andy, and grills the doctor over Andy needing a colonoscopy, but Andy tells his partner to relax, sees a beep, calls the office, and learns that the Highline case is falling apart. A month later in a hospital, Joe watches his wife give birth to their daughter, celebrates in the hall, and learns from his admin Iris of a message from Andy Beckett. In Joe's humble, cluttered office, unshaven Andy appears, shakes Joe's hand, elicits Joe's surprise at his appearance, and says, "I have AIDS," causing Joe to back up somewhat. Andy sits, admits he tried 9 lawyers before Joe, and tells his story that the Highline case mysteriously disappeared. He barely got it to the court in time, and he was nonetheless brought in front of the partners who, in flashback, apprise him of his faulty attitude problem, his fogginess lately, and his being fired. Joe asks for Andy to explain this like Joe's a 4-year-old, wonders why he was concealing his illness, doubts Andy's story of being sabotaged, fails to see a case, but also admits he won't take it for personal reasons, which his wife Lisa grills him about in a subsequent kitchen scene where Joe extensively evinces his prejudice and his worries over AIDS. In a library, Joe sees the librarian trying to move an ailing Andy to a private room, but Joe steps in and asks Andy for an update. So Andy shows Joe a book that Joe reads aloud, quote, "The Federal Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination against otherwise qualified handicapped persons who are able to perform the duties required by their employment," unquote. And that later rulings held that having AIDS qualified under the law because, as Joe goes on, quote, "This is the essence of discrimination, formulating opinions about others not based on their individual merits, but rather on their membership in a group with assumed characteristics," unquote. In the VIP suite at a Sixers game, Joe serves a summons to Charles Wheeler, who steps into the hall with his partners to explain why he refuses to settle. He didn't know Andy had brought a deadly disease into their office. And also, Andy dares to call him a bigot in front of Philadelphia society? Miguel's home movie brings us into Andy's family home reunion, where Andy asks if the trial will be hard on what turns out to be 1993's most loving possible family, including a mom who says she didn't raise her kids to sit in the back of a bus. In a magisterial courtroom during opening arguments to the jury, Joe claims Andy was fired because he has AIDS, and the firm's attorney, Belinda Conine, claims Andy was incompetent and is now angry because he's dying. During cross-examinations, Conine implies that Andy brought his disease upon himself. In a bar, Joe watches himself on TV leave the courtroom extolling the words of Philadelphia's founding fathers, but confirms for his fellow barflies he still hates gays. In a drugstore, a black law student tries to pick up Joe, who says, quote, and I'm keeping this quote exactly as it was in the movie, quote, "I'd have kicked your faggy little ass. That's exactly the kind of bullshit that makes people hate," unquote, people like this guy. Soon in court, Joe shifts gears with a witness to ask if he is gay, causing a court uproar that Joe quells by explaining that we have to bring sexual orientation, quote, "out of the closet," unquote, here, because it was part of the climate of fear and hatred that led to Andy's firing. At Andy's apartment, Miguel's frustration over Andy blowing off himself and his AZT shots leads Andy to consider planning his own memorial service, and then, instead, what he calls a gay party, as dozens of Halloween costumed friends fill his loft, dance, sing, revel, and introduce themselves to Joe and Lisa Miller. After the party, as arranged, Joe lingers to review Andrew's next day Q&A, but instead, Joe mentions how most people like him are brought up to see gays as monsters, and Andy parries Joe's trial rehearsal with post-mortem matters for Miguel, and letting himself speak and feel all of Maria Callas's aria La Mama Morta as Andy's close-up goes red. He balls his fist, quotes, "I am loved," and prompts Joe to go home, where Joe hugs his baby girl. On the witness stand, Joe prompts Andy to relive a story of partners in a sauna telling sexist and homophobic jokes that made Andy feel relieved not to have shared his sexual preferences with them beforehand. Andy says he loves the law because of sometimes being part of justice being done, and, quote, "that really is quite a thrill when that happens," unquote. As Belinda grills an ailing Andy, he sees her in increasingly shaky Dutch angles as she besmirches his lifestyle and brings a hand mirror to his face to show that he can't see any so-called lesions, but Joe grabs the mirror, approaches Andy, asks if he could still show his torso lesions like the ones the partners saw, waves off the defense's objection with a wheelchair analogy, and causes everyone to gasp at Andy's visible lesions. On the witness stand, Charles Wheeler vehemently maintains that Andy's work was subpar, eliciting Joe's sarcastic applause, and suddenly Andy's collapse as we cut to a manic hospital room of tubes and nurses and monitors and Miguel shouting, "It's not working." In a private room, the jury debates, deliberates, and then in court decides to award about $5 million in punitive damages to Andy, causing Andy's half of the courtroom to erupt in cheers. At the hospital, Joe arrives to ample approbation from Andy's allies. The way he carefully replaces Andy's oxygen mask tells us Joe has evolved. The family tells Andy they'll see him tomorrow, but after they're gone, a barely there Andy tells Miguel, "I'm ready." At Andy's loft post-mortem, Neil Young's high tenor, "I won't be ashamed," plays over friends and Joe and Lisa gathering as the camera pans in on home movies of Andy as a boy. Sam, what did you think of this movie? What stands out about it?
Well, it's funny. One of the things that you'd warned me you were going to ask me and haven't actually asked me, but about these characters,
Do they transcend cliches? Yeah, in general. Yeah,
and I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I feel like with I'm going to forget the names of the characters, but with Denzel Washington's character,
Joe, right? Joe,
yeah,
Joe, and then Miguel Banderas playing Miguel is kind of a cliche of the Hispanic effeminate. But go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
I don't feel that. I mean, I feel that there may be cliches that go into Joe. Certainly, that
yes,
I feel like he does transcend those cliches. With Miguel, I don't like to use the word effeminate, but I don't think he is. I don't think he is. that stereotype, but I do feel he is a stereotypical kind of fiery Latin lover kind of character.
Well, there is
Um,
that, which
uh,
also gets labeled.
Volatile,
And,
oh, he's everything pisses him off.
right.
I feel like he doesn't get a lot of, he doesn't get a lot of character development, and he
No,
is kind
that's
of
right.
a type. Um,
Yeah. Although I think Banderas does great work with the little bit of screen time he has.
oh, I mean, he's a fantastic actor, and he does a great job in this movie. It's interesting. I remember, well, doesn't. I remember my mother at the time, like, thinking that the actor, must be gay because he was
Oh
like,
yeah, remember how many people would say that like 30 years ago? That was like a common thing. I'm sorry, your mother was not alone at all, especially
right.
if you don't mind me saying in her generation. I think that was a very a thing you heard a lot.
And I don't know how many of the Almodovar movies she'd seen or any.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that would have necessarily,
Well,
been.
well, yeah. If you know those movies, yeah, I don't know that it would have changed your mind.
It wouldn't have been much of a counterpoint. And then Interview with a Vampire. I mean, there was sort of a combination
Sure.
of factors there. But yeah, I mean, it is a generational thing, and also I think it's a generational thing that's reflected in this film throughout. I mean, watching it now as opposed to watching it at the time, the frank homophobia, that in the like protagonists, that is expressed in here is, it's jarring. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to take at times, and it's interesting that I feel like it's accepted as just sort of the way things are in a way that would be treated differently now.
Yes.
Certainly, and which makes it kind of an interestingly of its time, while also really making an effort. I also, it's funny. I really noticed that in terms of Tom Hanks being like little Tommy Hanks and like being
Yeah.
very unthreatening and stuff. I very much noticed that like he and his boyfriend do not kiss in this movie.
Yeah.
Um,
There's one, but his head is blocking it, so you can't see
it's
it.
like a peck on a cheek. I don't know.
You're right. It could have been a peck.
Right.
Now they filmed something more, and they filmed them in bed shirtless together, but those scenes were cut, and people a lot. You're not. I hope I don't mean to interrupt you, but I can't help but think that I wanted to mention this anyway and ask you about it anyway, Sam. Where some gay activists felt, hey, nice try. I know that you're trying compared to Silence of the Lambs. You cleaned this up a little too. Demi's reaction was we had to cut the shirtless scene for time. They were like, you clean this up a little too much for the breeders. I think was one sign. Yeah. Did you have that thought too, or?
I was very aware of it. I was very aware that like while there's the contrast between the Hanks character and the woman who contracted AIDS, like
yeah,
it was like not her fault in a way that
that they based her basically on Alice Hoffman's novel.
Absolutely. But always not just, I mean, it's not subtext, it's text, that like the fact that he's gay makes it his fault that he has AIDS. That's the thing that's being argued in the courtroom.
Yeah.
However much they kind of slyly dance around it. And by the way, Mary Steenburgen.
Terrific!
I mean, it's such a wonderful. I mean, she's so great in it, but also it's like such an interesting like casting, like not exactly against type, but sort of playing with her type to make it even more insidious.
Oh my God, I love it. I can't think of a casting choice that I don't love from this film. I just wish it had been longer in some of these situations so that we could like get to even more of
right.
But yes, Steenburgen.
But what I was going to say is that like that, there's a way in which the Tom Hanks character is like, he's a gay guy, but he's not that gay. We don't see him, we don't see him kiss. We don't see them kissing. They really made an effort, however much it might have been made otherwise, just however much Demi might have wanted to make it otherwise. I don't know. That it really did feel sanitized in a way that, like, well, we don't want to offend anybody by
Sure.
sort of being too in your face with that he's a gay man, even though, it's obviously about him being a gay man and people's discomfort with. I don't know. There were ways in which that bothered me by going too far, but boy, I noticed.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
certainly
Fair
noticed
enough.
that. And also the thing about them not kissing, or maybe just a little, made me perhaps uncharitably think about this anecdote that was floating around at the time about
Go ahead.
6 degrees of separation,
Yeah, that came out at
um,
the same time.
and
Go
about
ahead.
Will Smith saying in the press
Yeah.
that, like, well, I mean, we had to cut the thing with me kissing my boyfriend because, like,
Yeah.
Denzel Washington told me not to,
Right.
not to kiss the guy on on film. And so, like, how could I not think about that while watching this movie?
It's interesting.
However uncharitably, however much it's like hearsay or whatever, I don't know.
Well, the thing is, to just defend Denzel a little, it was
Putting it on him. I mean, it's the
no, I
time.
know. It was then considered a career killer, which is part of what this movie's significance is that this movie, I'm sorry, but it did make it a little less of a career killer. You said early on in the podcast, baby steps. I call this a baby step, or even a toddler step. In a better a step as big as the steps taken by the home movie 6-year-old version of Tom Hanks's character in the very last shot of the film. Steps that big, because I think you needed this to say to future A-list actors, hey, it's not a career killer, but I totally agree with you that but looking back, it's like, it's a little tame. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, other thoughts? Go
I mean,
ahead.
let me say, if I haven't been clear about this, I like this movie. I liked it then.
Yeah.
I like it now. I think it's a good movie. There's a lot about it that I think is terrific. I feel like the courtroom scenes are fantastic, riveting. This.
It is very much a Frank Capra film, or a Howard Hawks, or a George Cukor. I mean, it does. And you know what? If you love older movies like that are very dialogue based and juice up the drama, and like Spencer Tracy comes in, this is to me an excellent film. If you like those kinds of films, you don't need flashy editing. I mean, it works on that level.
It's just that there are any number of times where I feel like, okay, that's a little heavy-handed, or okay, that's clearly,
Sure.
playing it safe. And just any number of ways where it just feels very of its time, that like there were certain things that they felt rightly or wrongly that they could do and that they couldn't do with this movie, and that it shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just historic, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I don't think this is a movie that opens it up to many different types of interpretation, but I love it for what it is. I was looking at some of the old reviews. They're like, it's a little cliched. It's sort of you always know where it's going. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I for me, Sam, at the end there, that scene with the home movies, even on this rewatch, even when I'm like trying to write down everything about the movie, I'm crying anyway. I mean, I don't do that for every film. I mean, this got me. I don't know. I consider this an impressive film. I don't know. I'm really happy that it was made. I don't know. Not just because Demi, I think, did, at least he tried to do the right thing. Maybe he didn't do everything the way a gay man would have done, or a gay woman, but we needed this film. This film moved America a little closer to where it needed to be. It didn't act alone. It wasn't the only movie that did that, but it was an important film, I think. Any other thoughts about it?
No, I mean, like I say, I like this movie. Yeah, I don't. Since I'm not teaching film or anything,
Right.
I always think about, like, well, would I recommend this movie?
Great question. Would you?
Under certain circumstances, like, it's not something that would be on my list of, like, oh my god. I know we're talking about a list.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But like, it's not something that I would necessarily say, oh my god, this is one of my favorite movies, you have to see it. Like, I like it. I liked it at the time. I like it now. I'm more aware of how differently it might be done today, but it was important that it was made at the time. So
Yeah. let me speak to that just a little bit so people know what I mean. So this was not the first film about AIDS. No. There were others. There were smaller films. There was 1990s, Longtime Companion. There were several films of what last podcast I called the new queer cinema. Well, that was B. Ruby Rich's term. She coined that. I'm going with her term for the new queer cinema. Like my own Private Idaho wasn't necessarily about AIDS, but I'm just, while looking at that movie, there's other edgier gay movies. Her definition of new queer cinema does not include a film like Philadelphia. Absolutely. She wouldn't have said this was, and it isn't, and it wasn't. But it was a hit. It was a #1 film at the box office, which was unthinkable. I mean, for at least 1 week, maybe 2, unthinkable for any previous film that even touched upon AIDS, really. Now, obviously, Philadelphia didn't act alone. I mean, I don't mean to give it that status. There were so many things that were sort of, I think, helping to evolve American attitudes from the 80s, where it had been a terrible time, I think, well sort of symbolized by Joe Miller's behavior. There was the fact of Magic Johnson admitting his HIV positive status and then playing on the 1992 Olympic Dream Team anyway. There was the AIDS quilt. There were increasingly visible pride marches, especially in 1993 was sort of a famously very visible one and vocal. There was the simple fact of Bill Clinton's election, which suggested turning the page on 12 years of repression. But I do think that when America filed into theaters to see Philadelphia and not be scared, yeah, it did play a role, like those other things did, in removing the stigma surrounding AIDS and gay men. And arguably, another chapter in this blemish reduction occurred in March of '94 when Tom Hanks won the Oscar for Best Actor and dedicated the award to a couple of his gay mentors, outing them, and by that move that he did, inspiring another film, a 1997 film called In and Out, which I can tell by your visual reaction, you know what I meant. In January 1994, the New York Times called Hanks the first frontline movie star to play a leading gay role in a major studio film. I'm reading that. That was in quotes. That's not true. Hank, the New York Times gets things wrong. Arguably, Al Pacino, William Hurt, Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon, William Hurt in Kiss of the Spider Woman, and even River Phoenix in My Own Private Idaho, because that did have studio funding. Arguably, any of them could earn that distinction. However, as much as I would say that, there was something about the 1-2-3 punch of, first, the Times saying that, second, Hanks winning the Oscar, and third, that summer, Hanks starring in one of history's best loved, best received dramas, Forrest Gump. Basically, as I've already said, agents were finding it harder to tell their A-list clients that playing gay was a career killer. That said, not everybody suddenly rushed to kiss a same-sex partner on screen, as you know. But some did, like Robin Williams, to be discussed next podcast. After Williams, Rob Epstein, Jeffrey Friedman, and Lily Tomlin had long been fundraising for a documentary loosely based on Vito Russo's book, The Celluloid Closet. It was only after the success of Philadelphia and after Hanks's Oscar win that HBO greenlit the project to include Hanks as a talking head. The Celluloid Closet as a movie barely resembles Russo's book. He was dead by then. He couldn't edit it. But it is certainly an enlightening examination of Hollywood's century of gay exclusion and demonization. Have you ever seen that movie, Sam, The Celluloid Closet? Yeah, okay. It's okay. After The Celluloid Closet was released in theaters in 1996, other marginalized groups wanted to make their own such films. And so we soon saw Small Steps, Big Strides, which is about Black milestones and marginalization over a century in Hollywood. The Bronze Screen about Latinos. In all these movies, they got 100 years worth of clips. The Slanted Screen about Asians, and Real Injun about Native Americans. In some ways, then, Philadelphia played a very small role in basically in high school and college students' awareness of Hollywood's century of bad practices and what Sam already called baby steps forward. You see those, when you're watching, that's kind of what these movies do. They tell you, here were all the horrible racist things, and also here were these few steps forward that were also good at the time. And, that's kind of what I do on this podcast a little bit, only I'm trying to summarize all those movies, and synthesize them into one chronological story, which doesn't always work, but that's fine. Any last thoughts about Philadelphia? Maybe I've already asked you that. Am I repeating myself, Sam? Sorry about that.
Well, I do.
Go ahead.
It's actually something that you reminded me of when you were talking now, which was when you referred to that there had been other, movies that dealt with AIDS, but like that this movie was really important in, making in reducing some of the fear and fear
Yes.
of people with AIDS. And I feel like there was something that was done so beautifully in this movie that I'd forgotten to comment on, which was, there's obviously the stuff about Joe um, being scared to touch.
Yeah.
Is it Andy? Is that the name of the Tom Hanks?
Andy. Yeah, Andy.
Andy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then going and talking to his doctor about it, like how is this transmitted? Obviously, that's very much text, but I felt like one thing that was not commented on, but was just beautifully done, was then we see Andy with his family holding a baby, everybody kissing him, and it's no big deal.
Yes.
And I felt like that was really beautifully done. That juxtaposition between the people who know better, who have been living with this, and who just do not treat him at all like he's a leper or something.
Yes.
And I felt like that was just something that was beautifully done.
Well, I thought, I, this idea of like the thing that you said you were very aware of, that this movie is kind of tame when it comes to gayness, and I see that. I also see that, like, the scene that you just mentioned where Andy is holding the baby, that we see that like about 40 minutes into the movie, he's holding that baby. And so that's a point where, it's beautiful. We're still kind of getting to that. We're committed to the movie. It's an hour and 15 minutes before we finally get to what Andy calls a gay party. I'm using Andy Beckett / Tom Hanks's term. He says to Joe, "Hey, you survived your first gay party." So, okay. My point though, Sam, is I do think, I hesitate to say this, but I think for a lot of mainstream Americans in 1993, this was smart placement of scenes. If you're gonna have a big gay Halloween party, like wait till it's an hour and 15 minutes into it, because then they can't leave. At that point, they've already heard Denzel make all these great arguments in court. They're not gonna. It's a less than 2 hour movie. They're not gonna leave at an hour and 15 minutes just because there's a bunch of just because there's 50 men in the room who are wearing Halloween costumes. And I guess what I'm saying is I think that was smart. Maybe not smart, defensible. I see why Demi did it. I see why Demi, having many friends, in the gay community, but still feeling like, how much can America handle? I get it. I get why he didn't do more. I mean, what do you think? Am I making too many excuses for him?
No, I mean, I think it's part and parcel of just everything we've been saying, that that Tom Hanks is a gateway in himself to establishing the audience's comfort. With the Andy character. I mean, obviously you might know something about the movie going in.
Yeah, I mentioned the movie Real Engine as one of the inheritors of Philadelphia to some degree. I began last podcast by saluting a film that many people laugh at today, which is history's highest grossing Western and highest grossing Hollywood film to be told half in subtitles. Even as Dances with Wolves was winning Oscars for the year 1990 and nearing a $200 million box office in North America during winter 1991. I'm telling you, Sam, despite all that, no one thought to cancel production on two big budget Christopher Columbus biopics whose releases were going to be timed to the quincentenary of the quote unquote discovery. However, Dances with Wolves was both reflector, much like Conscious Hip Hop, it was both reflector and director regarding rising pluralism. By fall of 1992, movie ticket buyers were in no mood to queue up to watch yet another whitewashed version of the Columbus story, which excluded all the slave taking and the genocide and everything else as usual. Those two films together didn't even earn a third of the total of Dances with Wolves. So that's a good thing. As the documentary Real Engine makes clear, Dances with Wolves led to a minor renaissance of pro-Indigenous films that mostly starred white guys or even white saviors as the protagonists, like The Last of the Mohicans, Thunderheart, Dead Man, and yes, Geronimo, a supposed biopic, I'm putting that in big quotation marks, of the legendary figure Geronimo that is actually told, if you watch it, through a white character played by Jason Patrick. He has a much larger role than Wes Studi's Geronimo. Okay, anyway, Smoke Signals from 1998 gets discussed next podcast. Now, I don't dismiss, Sam, any of these post-Wolves' dancings, but the one that has held up best and influenced the most people, however problematically, remains the Disney version of Pocahontas. I know we're going to talk about why problematically. Okay. One disadvantage to reading about Disney's development process is that authors tend to entirely elide non-animated influences. Without the success of Dances with Wolves, it's hard to imagine that the studio would have ever greenlit Pocahontas. Never mind cast indigenous actors in the indigenous roles. That's crucial to why it's here on this list. An advantage to reading about Disney's development process is that there is plenty of other material about the making of their animated films. Oh yeah. Oh my God, Sam, what I sifted through to get to this. Let me try to summarize some of that. The Disney Renaissance, in my opinion, Sam, was both calculated and something of a lucky break for Jeffrey Katzenberg and Michael Eisner. If the two men running Walt Disney Studios had had any idea that princess movies would be such cash cows, they would have been making one a year since 1984, when Disney came close to filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They didn't know. But that said, after Beauty and the Beast became history's first animated Best Picture nominee, Katzenberg enthusiastically pursued whatever might be their next prestige princess project. This is also when Katzenberg committed the studio's adult division to the Joy Luck Club. So at that time, at the time that Beauty and the Beast got that surprise nomination, Aladdin and The Lion King, and if John Lasseter and Pixar ever got it together, Toy Story, they were already well into development. They were in the hopper. They were seemingly targeted toward boys. Disney needed its next girl movie. That was the feeling at the studio. So who do they go to figure that out? Oh, you know, all their men who run everything there. So Eric, here's all the white guys. Like, here's some of them. Eric Goldberg, Joe Grant, Peter Schneider. They were all pitching these various kind of Romeo and Juliet-ish pieces at the time. Mike Gabriel, director of Rescuers Down Under, he took a picture of Peter Pan's tiger lily. He wrote on it the word Pocahontas as part of his pitch that got reappropriated into this kind of cross-cultural courtship / conflict thing that was like the other Romeo and Juliet scripts. From there, Katzenberg assembled the many moving parts, like using supervising animator Glenn Keane, oh right, another white guy, to turn the title character into what Katzenberg called, quote, I'm quoting Jeffrey Katzenberg, the most idealized and finest woman ever made, unquote. Okay, that's what they wanted, that's what they worked on. Like Ariel and Belle, Pocahontas would become a sort of a statuesque teenage striver with sidekicks. That said, Katzenberg repeatedly asked his anointed directors, Gabriel and Goldberg, to tone down the kooky animal hijinks. A lot of the animators were disappointed that the animals lost their dialogue. The relative seriousness extended to casting. Eventually, American Indian movement leader Russell Means was cast as Chief Powhatan, James Apahumat Fall as Kokuum, Gordon Tutusis as Kikata, Michelle St. John as Nekoma, and Irene Bedard as the title character. Considering the budget for Pocahontas, which was about $55 million, was well over double that of Dances with Wolves, I can honestly say as a film historian, no indigenous descended Americans have never played such major roles in such an expensive production and hadn't up to that point and never would again. So, I mean, we're waiting, Sam. I'm waiting for the next $50 million movie to even half star indigenous people, never mind all. I mean, I'd love that. I'm sitting here, I'm checking my watch, I'm waiting. Where's this train coming, Sam? Because it's not coming. The loss of librettist Howard Ashman in 1991 was arguably one of the reasons Jonathan Demme had pivoted his AIDS movie to more directly combat homophobia. Beauty and the Beast was dedicated to Ashman, to the gay Ashman, who had composed his lyrics and those of The Little Mermaid alongside score master Alan Menken. For Pocahontas, Katzenberg pushed Menken to partner, obviously, songwriting partner with lyricist Stephen Schwartz, causing some creative tensions. Schwartz, for his part, traveled to Jamestown, Virginia during summer '92, researched sea shanties and Native American music, and was inspired by Chief Seattle's famous letter to the United States Congress to begin the lyrics to Colors of the Wind. After Schwartz and Menken presented this, their first song together, Gabriel and Goldberg, the directors would regularly refer to Colors of the Wind, the song, as sort of the heart of the soul of the film, the essence of what the film was trying to say. Pocahontas begins in 1607 in London, where we see sailors boarding a ship to these sounds of a song gushing about God, gold, glory, and the Virginia Company. At sea, the wild waves gushing pull a man named Thomas overboard, but young, long, blonde-haired John Smith jumps in the ocean and pulls Thomas back on board, to the commendation of the overfed, overbearing Governor Ratcliffe, who mutters to his small dog that he'll need pawns like Thomas and Smith to dig up his gold. In Secamacaha, Virginia, the Powhatan tribe cheerfully sings, steady as the beating drums, they work and gather. Chief Powhatan notes the absence of his teenage daughter, Pocahontas, whom we soon see standing like a statue upon a sunrise-lit cliff. Pocahontas vibes with her sidekicks Flit, the hummingbird, and Miko the raccoon, dives off the cliff, plays with her pal Nakoma, tells her of a dream of a spinning arrow, returns to the village, and chats with her dad, who wants her to marry the sturdy, strong, serious Kocoum, a notion Pocahontas equates to ending her dreams as she sings just around the river bend. Pocahontas consults with an old face in a tree, the grandmother Willow, who sings to her to listen with your heart. Upon the arrival of Ratcliffe's ship, John Smith courageously observes movement in the forest, while Pocahontas clandestinely observes Smith and the other whites, who, cued by Ratcliffe, begin to dig out Jamestown while singing that any gold or resources will be, quote, mine, mine, mine. In the midst of a waterfall, John Smith points his musket at Pocahontas, who moves evasively, gets followed by Smith, fails to understand Smith's English, but finally listens to her heart, which apparently teaches her English, as she tells Smith, my name is Pocahontas. In nascent Jamestown, Ratcliffe works his diggers to the bone, throws a half-eaten bone to the woods, hits a native, arms the men for battle, starts one, shoots an indigenous man, and watches as the Powhatan retreat. Next to a distant river, John Smith offers Pocahontas coquetry and colonial concepts about improving the lives of savages. So she corrects his colonialism with her cantillation of Colors of the Wind, accompanied by an awesome array of scenery and, song's end, goodbye. In Jamestown for days, John Smith works with soldiers building the fort, but leaves it just before Ratcliffe decides that the Indians must be hiding the gold. Smith finds Pocahontas lingering at the edge of the village, takes her on a private stroll, admires the land, asks about gold, shows her a coin, and learns she's never seen anything like gold. Pocahontas returns to her village to see that another tribe has arrived and her people are winding up for a war on the whites. John Smith returns to Jamestown to a similar situation and asserts the Indians can help them navigate rivers and such, but Ratcliffe claims that anyone who even looks at a gold-hoarding, lying, murderous savage, quote, without killing him on sight, will be tried for treason and hanged, unquote. Pocahontas and John Smith each sneak out of their respective villages to find each other near Grandmother Willow, where Smith warns her to warn the Powhatan the whites are on the warpath, but she and the Willow convince Smith to try to stop them through diplomacy. As Smith and Pocahontas kiss on it, Kocoum war whoops, attacks, pins Smith, and gets shot dead by Thomas, whom Ratcliffe had sent to follow Smith, who cues Thomas to scatter before the arrival of Kocoum's allies, who carry Smith to the village, where he is imprisoned and visited by an apologetic Pocahontas. Both armies rile themselves up by singing, savages, savages, barely even human, as Pocahontas finds Smith's compass, reflects on her dream of the spinning arrow, and agrees with Grandmother Willow that she knows her path and must follow it. As the British enclose the Powhatan, they prepare to kill Smith, but Pocahontas barely successfully argues for Smith's life as her father puts down his weapon. Ratcliffe senses treachery, fires at the native leaders, and hits Smith, who intercepts the bullet, causing the other English soldiers to turn on Ratcliffe, argue that Smith was right all along, and put Ratcliffe in chains despite his threats. Thomas tells Pocahontas that the wounded Smith will die if he does not return to London for medical care. And when Smith invites Pocahontas to come with him, she says she's needed at home, but that she'll be with him in spirit, kissing him goodbye tenderly. Pocahontas runs to that one high cliff and looks again like a statue as she watches the ship sail away.
Oh gosh, I have so many thoughts about this movie. let me just say up front, I do not like this movie.
Ah,
I didn't
okay,
like
good
it.
to know.
I didn't like it at the time. I like it less now.
Ah, okay,
I
bold. Yeah, go ahead.
uh, it's interesting. I mean, something needed to change. In turn, you look at Disney's previous animated features, and like the only ones with non-white leads were like Aladdin, and then long before that, The Jungle Book, and then you get into like, well, the Song of the South really count as mostly um,
Yeah,
and they were not great on this. So like it was definitely, they were definitely trying. They were definitely trying to do something here. And as you say, the casting is super important. I'm very glad that Smoke Signals is going to be on your list later because to me, like that was a movie that I really liked and that I felt like, okay, this is a great positive thing in a
sure.
way that I did not feel about Pocahontas
Yeah,
because um, it I feel like making this kind of movie about an actual person who actually existed.
yes.
All of these like Disney princess movies and all these, they're taking is fairy tales or children's literature or you know myths and legends, however you want to frame it, and they're completely bowdlerizing them and making them family friendly and cute songs in them and stuff, but doing that with actual people who actually existed is so, I mean, problematic is, a word that's used a lot, but it's so problematic. This movie is centered around a love story that, while famous, so didn't happen. The John Smith and Pocahontas love story. I mean, not just because she was 11 at the time, although, she was like 10 or 11 at the time.
Well,
It was
the first time they met. Supposedly she was older when they met years later, but yes, but no,
years
that's
later in England when she was married to, yeah. I mean,
right.
I
Okay,
guess she wasn't
sure.
married, but yeah, yes, they met years later. She still didn't,
Yeah,
there still wasn't a connection. But
yeah.
anyway, um, it's a famous thing that
No, no,
people, for
you're
some
right.
reason,
Yeah, yeah. That was
know
one
about.
of Angela Elise, UCLA professor, mentioned that in the LA Times that like that was one of her problems with it. I mean, that's not her. The fact that she was, and also she felt that the character had been over sexualized. She's got the shoulder thing
Hmm.
off, and like, what is this? It doesn't seem like anything like what the real Pocahontas would have been like. And it's not even her name. That's like sort of her nickname. But
Well,
anyway,
yeah, it's not her name, and fair enough. Her name was like something secret that, like, and not secret, but like, not something that she would tell,
right.
these white guys in the first place. So, like, using her nickname, it's fine. It's at least not something that they made up.
Right.
It's um uh, but then just the whole thing of like, it's very well intentioned in the way it treats, like, well, these European settlers or colonizer are, they're singing about you know wanting to like despoil the place for gold and killing savages. So clearly we're not painting them in this incredibly sanitized light, except they are, except it does. I mean, certainly you have this thing like when they realize that, like, oh, the Indians are really nice, then suddenly they like, oh, well, clearly we need to tie up our governor and send him off to England. Like that, quibbling about these things in a movie where like John Smith and Pocahontas can literally magically speak the same language because of the power of love.
Right.
Obviously we're not supposed to take this all that literally, but I think that there's this sort of germ of believing that, like, well, since this is a movie about historical figures, there has to be something about this story that is true, and there is not.
Right.
It takes certain things that happened, like John Smith being taken prisoner. That's honestly something that happened. I mean, by the time he came along, I believe there was already a healthy trade between this tribe and the Jamestown settlers,
Right. Yeah.
and like she was known to everybody
Right.
by then as like somebody who like brought the groceries essentially. I mean, she I don't know. There are a lot of like little nods to actual people, like the warrior who she's totally not into was actually like her first husband. I mean, there's um there are
Yeah. And
elements in there.
it does feel like Disney would never do this with, like, say, George Washington's story or some other story, or like even the Pilgrims. Like, it feels like, well, maybe the Pilgrims is a bad example because I'm pretty sure that every version we've ever been told is about as true as this movie, but or almost every. But I'm saying it feels like they wouldn't do, like, they feel like, it feels like they're taking more liberties because they think they can than they would with like other revered white figures like a Thomas Jefferson or something like that. I don't know. I guess I'm saying I feel, I don't know. It does seem like that they wouldn't. They're doing it because they're kind of saying, oh, it's a myth anyway, so we'll make it even more of a myth, which yes, I agree, is somewhat is, like you said, problematic, not ideal.
Yeah. And I mean, it all sort of raises the question, like, well, how would you treat this story? You can't, like,
Sure.
Obviously it's ridiculous to have the settlers, throwing the governor back on a boat to England, but at the same time, supposedly the governor was actually captured, skinned alive, and burned at the stake. You're obviously not going to tell that story.
You're right.
But so the question becomes, like, well, how would you tell this story differently? And I feel like, well, maybe baby steps. Great. It's great that they made these, that they made this progress in terms of casting and all these things. But is it a story that needed to be told at all?
Right.
No. I no.
Right.
And I feel in a way it shouldn't have been. I feel like at the time, it is important in the evolution of Disney movies and the evolution of all sorts of films, but like, this is not only a movie that I would not recommend, this is the movie that I will not show my son, and if he ever becomes interested in it, we will have, that's fine, but we will have some serious conversations about it while watching it.
Right. We should mention to the audience you have a younger son.
Right. Yeah, my son's 6.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Many Native Americans agreed with you or agree with you. There's, some said it's distorted history beyond recognition. I already quoted Angela Leese. There were anthropologists saying that, there's all these specific, like, takedowns of specific, and we need all that. I think that's fair. I don't even want to, I mean, I'm going to give Russell Means his day in court because I think he deserves that for his work as as working for the American Indian movement. But then he has his own self-interest. I mean, this is a movie he's participating in, so of course he's going to say that. He claimed that Pocahontas was the first time Eurocentric male society had admitted its historical deceit. I don't know that that's really true. But it was at least there was something, at least it is telling kids that, white people didn't just show up and bring like unicorns and rainbows. The Europeans are there to, it seems like they're there to kill and to rape and pillage the land. That's that. And now, granted, it's getting so many of its facts wrong, but it is getting that right. And teaching kids that probably is valuable compared to what they've generally been taught. He claimed it was the first time that in a movie that a human face had been put on an Indian female. I don't know if I agree with that either. But anyway, there was another lady in the Atlantic who felt like she said, also Native American, she said it had a progressive attitude when it came to interpreting history. This idea of the white guy saying gold, God, and glory, and us, we're not supposed to think that that's good, certainly not later. The movie begins that way. They're looking for non-existent gold. They're intent upon murdering the heathen savages. I don't know. It's funny. It's a strange thing for me. I can believe both of these things. I don't know why. I can hold two of these things in my hand at the same time, or I find it like I can agree with you, or I can 100% see what you're saying. And at the same time, I kind of also understand this defense of the movie's basic attitude, at least, where, and it is a novel, and I'm sorry, but for kids, it was a novel attitude. And, at the time, and kids are so influenced by Disney movies. I mean, this is the other thing for me is what I find every year that I teach, Sam, I find that if I give my college students now, the choice of writing about animation, more and more of them every year want to say yes to that. They love animation, and I think that like, and for them, they didn't grow up like you and I did when animation was considered almost like. And I know obviously you're a comic book guy. You know, you're not. I know what you might say to what I'm about to say, but it was considered like a an inferior genre when we were kids. It was considered like, serious actors didn't do it, A-list actors didn't do it. It was considered like it was like beneath everybody. But for them, I mean, it's so different for them. For them, it's like their number. I know animation's not a genre, but it's like their number one genre, and they love it. And so I feel like they grow up on a lot of the films, especially from the Disney Renaissance, especially The Lion King and Aladdin. And I think they see Pocahontas, and I don't think it redounds completely negatively for them. Not all. I mean, I think it's good to some degree, but I at the same time I take on all, and I don't like that Pocahontas is so kind of sexualized. I mean, that part I can never get past, that they could have done that differently. They could have just, she could have been like Lilo and Stitch. She could have been like, she could have been like a 10-year-old kid. I mean, whatever, without a romance. I don't know, but okay. Any thoughts? I mean, was that a defense? Am I being too Pollyanna again?
No, I mean, I can buy all of that, and I don't want to undersell that I do think that this was well intentioned, and I do certainly take on that, like, um they did not portray the European colonizers in entirely sympathetically. I still feel too sympathetically in terms of how they to completely turn themselves around, with the exception of the one bad guy. But
Yeah.
uh but I mean, I don't feel that it was a completely insidious thing. And I feel like, my problems with it are basically, you know just have to do with, like, that this is, that there is a real story under this. And had this been an entirely fictional story with entirely fictional characters, I wouldn't be so hard on it. I would still have,
Uh,
some of the same criticisms. And also, had I, you know, had it been more entertaining for me in general, had it been funnier, had I enjoyed the songs more, had it been like, oh, this movie's so much fun, it's a shame about this and this. But I also feel it's kind of a dull movie.
yeah.
So
Right. Oh, that's funny. I sort of let. I'm always impressed how many songs there are. Like, this movie's filled with music compared to
and
some of
I
the.
love Disney movies. I mean, I'm not somebody who's coming in and like, oh, this is just kid stuff. Like,
Right.
I do like these movies in general, and this one I found just kind of dull to begin with. So go
I
ahead.
do. I mean, I'll be the first to say that there's something regressive about our culture's general reliance on the Pocahontas narrative, or the bowdlerized version of that narrative, as evidenced by the 45th president. I'm not going to name him. Using the name Pocahontas to refer to a sitting U.S. senator like that. We should be doing better than that anyway. I mean, like, we need way more stories of more Native Americans told by Native Americans. I mean, it's not enough to have Russell Means come out and defend this movie. Russell Means needs to make movies like this and cast more of his friends. Now, right now, that's only just beginning to happen on a mainstream level with this new show, Reservation Dogs, where Sterling Harjo is, and Taika Waititi. I'm sorry, I can't say his name, but so there's a little bit of indigenous. This is happening, but it's so late. It's 25 years after Pocahontas or more. I mean, we should, we need. I mean, I get frustrated that the only story, there's all these trappings of a love story, which seem like, they kind of flatter white people anyway. They kind of flatter the white perspective of like, well, if we just understood each other better, just like if my last girlfriend understood me, then I'm sure everything would be fine. Well, no, it's not quite that simple. We're colonizers. Essentially, the analogy should basically be to rape. I mean, I hate to, I don't want to bring down the whole podcast, but the analogy of what what your and my forefathers did to this country is rape. And I don't know that I'm seeing that.
Including Pocahontas.
Yes. Well, there you go. That's what I'm saying. So we don't, that part of the Pocahontas narrative, not really seeing that, you know? I mean, and by that, I mean the fake version, the kid, you know, with the kids, with the pilgrims, when they're making the turkeys with their hands on the, you know, in first grade, like your kid probably would now, if he'd had a regular first grade non-Zoom or whatever. But I mean, you know, that whole. But I'm just saying that those silly things they tell the kids now, we can do better than that. We can tell a little more truth. And I do, yeah. I think baby step. Okay, you know how I said Philadelphia was toddler steps or even 6-year-old steps. This is like centipede, tiny. To me, Pocahontas is taking little steps toward. So I mean, I get the heart being in the right place is something. A song like Colors of the Wind, and you can tell the lyrics are based on something like Chief Seattle's speech, you know, like you think that you know what you know, but you don't even know what you don't know. And, you know, you don't listen, you don't understand the world around you. I mean, there's a good message there, you know. I wouldn't say that's nothing, you know, it just could be done better, you know.
Sure, sure. And there were, you know, there were nods made. I mean, I don't know much. I don't know much about, you know, traditional indigenous music, but like, you know, there were attempts made to sort of conjure it, and like bits of language and this and this and that, you know, there were. And one thing I want to make clear is while I think it was ridiculous to make this movie based around this love story that never happened. I mean, Disney didn't make that up either. Like it was something that, for whatever reason, was an already existing myth. Like one thing that every time I think about this movie, I get those lines from Fever in my head, yeah, about John
Right.
Smith and Pocahontas, you know, which obviously is a much older movie. And one reason I get it in my head is because I don't get any of the songs from this movie in my head ever.
As you made clear. That's funny. Yeah. No, I think we can all look forward to the day when somebody else spends, I don't even know, half of Pocahontas' budget on an all indigenous cast. You know, because I think we're ready. I think this many years later we're ready. So, you know, but in any event, it's interesting to me though that I will absolutely stand by the fact that after Dances with Wolves, I'm 100% sure that Pocahontas is the most seen of like Native American stories. And I only know that because of my kids, because of and by my kids, I mean my college students. Like they see these movies. Now they don't all see Pocahontas, but a lot of them do, you know. So for them, it's like they're absorbing this into their bloodstream. So yeah, I'm actually happy that you're diagnosing their bloodstream as a little bit problematic. No, I think that's good. But it could have been worse, I guess. You know. Anyway, yeah. I don't know. I'm glad. I'm really grateful to everything you say. I think it's helpful for us. Um, okay. Anything else about Pocahontas before I move on to the fifth and final, which hopefully won't be as we won't hate as much.
Well, I want to say that I just feel a little bad that, like, just as it happens, because we're going through these movies in what chronological order,
Yeah.
you know, that like I feel like I've had this sort of dwindling enthusiasm just in
Yeah.
terms of the way you know, that I happen to just absolutely love Malcolm X, and I
Yeah.
really,
I
you know,
know. Well, it just
and
happened to work.
Pocahontas just kind of pisses me off.
You know what? Maybe, but rather than say that you've done something wrong, I would almost argue that maybe as we start moving through the 90s, we start seeing kind of diminishing returns a little bit. I mean, not always, but you know, the kind of the heady days of the Boys in the Hoods and the Thelma Louises, maybe those were getting a little more rare, basically, as we move to the mid '90s. Not always. I mean, look, there's always going to be some good ones. I don't, but you know, you might make a point. It might be where Hollywood was, I don't know what, watering these things down more than they had been. You know, or maybe Malcolm X, we just got really lucky that basically Spike Lee just, you know, I don't know, that he got all that loan money from all those black celebrities. Not, it wasn't a loan, he said.
But also, one reason that I feel a little bad about it is because it sort of misrepresents my viewing experience a little bit, because I did not watch these movies in chronological order. Like, the last one of these that I rewatched was Malcolm X, and so like
Yeah.
I came out of this experience on a real high, and so I
Yeah.
kind of feel like, as we go down here, I'm getting more and more negative. And sneak preview, I'm not going to get more negative than I am about Pocahontas, but like,
Okay, that my audience just exhaled. They were waiting to exhale. They've exhaled now. Thank you. Uh, well, that is probably where I ought to start my little segue. One of Eisner and Katzenberg's little side projects, the Joy Luck Club, released in 1993 through Hollywood Pictures, became, as I almost said, the first eight-figure budgeted film to mostly consist of women of color. Okay, and that's accurate. Look that up. As I almost continued to say, its screenwriter Ron Bass understood the outrageousness of this statistic as well as anyone. I should call him the co-screenwriter. Two things happened in 1992 that Bass felt might change the game so that there would be more than one such film than the Joy Luck Club. First, Terry McMillan's third novel, Waiting to Exhale, was released and became a New York Times bestseller. And second, after he got America Dancing with Wolves, Sam, during Christmas 90, after he got America arguing over who killed JFK during Christmas 91, hey, look who came back in Christmas 92 to serve as the bodyguard, Mr. Kevin Costner, to first-time fiction film actress Whitney Houston, resulting in history's highest grossing, to that point, cross-racial romance movie, and history's highest grossing single by a woman, which is apparently a record it still holds, I Will Always Love You. In addition to everything else she already was, Whitney Houston was now also a movie star, having gone one for one. What would be her second film? Well, Sam, after a series of meetings, Houston came to terms with 20th Century Fox to front the film adaptation of Terry McMillan's Waiting to Exhale. Now, as with Amy Tan, Ron Bass was happy to share screenwriting and producing duties with novelist but novice screenwriter Terry McMillan, making sure that the novelist, as he did with Tan, kept veto power over the script and every other aspect of production. See, I'm sorry, but Bass, maybe he's a jerk in real life, but he's an ally. As with Amy Tan, Bass sought a director who understood the community, and after a series of meetings, they were happy to make a first-time director of the enthusiastic and brilliant actor Forrest Whitaker. Of course, with Whitney Houston on board, the budget was going to get a little higher than the Joy Luck Club's $10.5 million. Fox's final number was around $16 million, which, by the way, this isn't a coincidence. It was about the same as Steven Spielberg and Quincy Jones's budget for The Color Purple, exactly 10 years before. Now, maybe you were thinking when I was talking about women in color, well, what about women? What about The Color Purple? Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, I think Danny Glover's role, and like there are other men that are pretty big in The Color Purple in a way that the Joy Luck Club and Waiting to Exhale aren't. I think. I mean, you could argue. What do you think? I'm citing this thing about women of Joy Luck Club being first and Waiting to Exhale second. Am I wrong? Does The Color Purple count, Sam? I don't know. You tell me.
I don't have an opinion about that.
Okay, yeah, we don't have to come to a decision about that. I will say that as referentes, The Color Purple, Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dusk, and the novels of Toni Morrison were a lot more historical, histrionic, and almost mythological than Terry McMillan wanted her characters to be. Terry McMillan's whole point was that her characters should not have the kind of incest instigated existential crises of someone like Celie from The Color Purple. Instead, Savannah, Bernadine, Robin, and Gloria, they would have this kind of small scale modern problems that previously had been reserved for white people. That was McMillan's whole point. Prior to this film, outside of supporting roles, lonely, unhappy, middle-class Black female professionals were basically invisible on screen. They didn't exist, Sam. The idea was for something closer to the wit, wisdom, and wistfulness of the one sisterhood scene from Jungle Fever, but for an entire movie instead of just that one scene in Jungle Fever. So fresh off revelatory turns as Betty Shabazz and Tina Turner in the previous two Christmases, Angela Bassett was a logical co-lead to Houston. Although, one little problem I have with this film, Sam, I don't know if you thought of this. She's such a strong presence, it's almost hard for me to believe that her character, Bernie, had been so long cuckolded. Like, do you think that while you're watching this? I'm like, nobody could have gotten away with this against Angela Bassett for this long? Did you have that thought, or was that just me?
I mean, not specifically, but certainly, you get this impression that she was a bit of I mean, relative to the way that she is later, a little bit of a doormat in their relationship, and you certainly don't,
Yeah, I can't,
and you certainly can't see that in her.
I can't
Uh,
buy her as a doormat. I'm sorry,
not
I
at
don't
all.
know what it is. I can't. I find it hard to do that. But
She is formidable.
yeah.
Um,
Well, casting is destiny. Yes. So mostly African American films, like Color Purple, were one thing. Literally every speaking part in Waiting to Exhale is spoken by a Black person, although Kelly Preston shows up uncredited just so that Angela Bassett can knock her out. In other words, a decade before Tyler Perry began to change the game, Waiting to Exhale projected a modern world that did not have or need non-Black people. That was something different and great. Everyone involved understood the special and unprecedented nature of the project, and many of Hollywood's Black male stars came to work for relatively cheap, including Wesley Snipes, Gregory Hines, Giancarlo Esposito, Dennis Haysbert, Kelty Williamson, and Wendell Pierce. Whitney Houston offered a song, of course, called Exhale, Shoop, Shoop, but she also helped set up the soundtrack consisting only of songs by African American women, with one exception, one song by Prince. Okay, that's my pre-thing about the movie. I want to jump into the plot summary. Any thoughts, that anything I skipped over too much?
well, there was one thing that I noticed that you sort of touched on here when you talked about these, stars who were in it. I noticed that a number of them were uncredited. I mean, Kelly,
Yes.
you mentioned Kelly Preston, but also, I mean, Wesley Snipes and Giancarlo
Yeah.
Esposito, who
Yeah.
have like, you know, major scenes in the movie
Yeah.
that they're uncredited. And I wondered at the time, I mean, it sort of stuck with me that like, was there, you can do that for a number of reasons. One, it's supposed to be a surprise that they're in it, or maybe some contractual thing that like if you listed them in the credits, you'd have to pay them way more than was actually possible. And I didn't know like what there had to be some reason why they're not in the credits, and I
You know
didn't.
what? I didn't dig that up in my research, but you're absolutely right to point that out. I did think that was sort of an interesting thing, but it does give the feeling of the movie a feeling of a labor of love. I think a little bit. I mean, even if I may not think this is a perfect film, but but I love that about it. That clearly people felt that okay, we'll take. I mean, obviously that happens all the time. You get people taking like no money to do a cameo, but still, I thought that I don't know. I liked it. About that. I like that about it. I guess I don't know why. Okay, why don't I jump on in here then? Waiting to Exhale begins with New Year's resolutions, voice overing initial impressions of Savannah, driving through Thelma and Louise country. That part was different than the book. To Phoenix. Bernadine, already there, busy working and parenting. Robin, walking, causing rubberneckers, and Gloria, big box store shopping. Bernie's husband John dumps her for a white woman as each woman looks at herself in the mirror in readying for New Year's, with Savannah arriving at a party, dancing with a handsome Lionel, seeing a woman treat him as a boyfriend, and leaving to be home in time for Dick Clark. At a hair salon, an effeminate dresser tells Robin and Gloria, well, apparently I have no problem with that word effeminate. Now you got me thinking about, you know what? I'm going to take that word out of my vocabulary. Sam, that's a good note. You know what? I'm now thinking about it. Okay, at a hair salon, one of the stylists tells Robin and Gloria that John left Bernie, but they and Savannah fail to get her on the phone because she is busy emptying John's closet, dumping all his stuff into his BMW and setting it ablaze. Robin has awkward sex with this guy, Michael, whose body she compares to a submarine sandwich, but afterward, his enthusiasm and his promises make her forget his looks and remember feeling young and alive. Gloria's ex, David, comes to her house to see their son and comes out of the closet. Later, after Gloria finds her teen son, Tariq, in flagrante with a young girl, she uses David's visit as a reason that he can't go to Spain and blurts his dad's secret, causing Tariq to shout, my dad's, the F word that I don't say that rhymes with maggot. Bernie garage sales John's stuff with their kids, arrives at his office and slaps his mistress, but he insists on keeping the business, the settlement, and their kids. To the sounds of Whitney Houston-ish music, Lionel behaves like an animal in bed with Savannah. That was really a weird one for me, Seb. I'm like, it's weird because I'm watching Whitney Houston in a sex scene and it feels like we're hearing her. It wasn't actually her singing, but it was like so close that I'm like, this is weird. I don't know. Maybe that was just me. After Bernie insists that Gloria chop off most of her hair, Bernie's hair, Gloria, Bernie, Savannah, and Robin go out to a bar together where Bernie dances flirtatiously with a new man, Herbert, while Robin is outraged to see Michael with a new girlfriend. Robin goes to a party with a new beau named Russell, who assumes she wants space and wine, but later his enthusiasm for her to meet his mother makes her think well of him. Excuse me. At a carnival, Bernie and Gloria ride a Ferris wheel, watch ostrich and llama riders. Where is this carnival? And chat about the inadvisability of marrying. Sorry, Sam, have you been to a car? Have you ever seen ostrich or llama riders like you did in this movie? I'm serious. I haven't seen this. I want to go to this thing. As Robin dumps Troy, he drunkenly staggers under her balcony, claiming that black women complain too much and drive black men like him to white women. Gloria sees Marvin moving furniture, introduces herself, learns he likes women like his ex, quote, with a little meat on their bones, unquote, invites him to dinner, gets him to agree that Tariq will bring him a plate, and twitters as she feels him watch her walk away. In court, Bernie loses what her lawyer calls round one and calls John an Uncle Tom, but he calls her reductive and foolish for trying for $300,000. In the bar downstairs, civil rights attorney James Wheeler, who you mentioned, Wesley Snipes showing up uncredited, chats up Bernie, seems to hit on her, explains why it hurts to slowly lose his wife to cancer, goes up to her hotel room and confesses that he loves his white wife and would never do anything to hurt her, so they, quote, make something beautiful, unquote, by spooning that night. That's the way he puts it. Savannah produces her first segment at her TV station and goes to an open-air mall with the married Kenneth, who calls her the only woman he ever loved, leading to a rather erotic congress. The four ladies gather in Gloria's living room for her birthday, where they sing, dance, laugh, listen to music, get drunk, complain about men, and just barely stop Bernie from a bad phone call to John. On the phone, Savannah's mother says she's been reduced to food stamps, but she wants her daughter to romance the still married Kenneth, whom Savannah watches doting on his daughter on the phone. His daughter. Married Russell comes to Robin, who gets fed up with him, gets rebuked by him, and gets a phone call from Troy, making Russell jealous and Robin joyous. In Gloria's kitchen, Marvin surprises her by siding with Tariq's wish to go to Spain. But soon, in a full church, the preacher surprises Tariq by announcing he'll soon be off to Spain. Oh, as Tariq hugs his mom gratefully. At a water park, Robin admits to Savannah that she had an affair with a married man who convinced her to have an abortion. In some ways, that's the most serious moment of the whole movie. Bernie reads an emotional letter from James and goes to court to receive an eminently reasonable divorce settlement that Bernie and Savannah cheer at John's expense. At her condo swimming pool, Savannah uses some choice words to break it off with Kenneth, then later shouts on the phone at her disapproving mom that that her mom ought to ask her more about her job than her friends. But then she calls her mom back and she apologizes for disrespecting her. Similarly, Robin refuses Russell a repeat ingress. With Tariq gone from the house, Gloria confesses to Marvin that she's treated him terribly, but he says he loves her. They kiss as we see a wet purple Arizona sunset behind them. Presumably a year after the beginning, as a DJ mentions New Year's Eve, and as Roberta Flack sings It Might Be You, the four women drive together, skip a party, drive to the waterfront, light a bonfire, pop champagne, and hug. Okay, Sam, this is it. Finally, you've been so patient. You've sat through these. That was the last one. What do you think of this little film, Waiting to Exhale?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting one for me because it's the only one of these movies that I had not seen before.
Okay.
And it's a movie that I personally was not into particularly. Like I didn't like it all that much, while at the same time respecting it tremendously. Like I'm super happy that it exists. I love that it had, as you say, every, entirely African American speaking cast. I like that it's centered around these women. There was another.
No, you're okay.
But there was another thing I wanted to say in that sort of litany. I like that, I like that it's a story that's very centered on these women and their, and their own finding their own power, and there's, and person, and while at the same time, there's a line in it that's I think verbatim. You know what we all have in common. None of us have a man, and it's like that is not a story that I'm particularly interested in watching. Uh, um,
Yeah.
I'm not that. The music is not really my thing. This kind of smooth R&B. It's fine.
Right.
Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, the cast is tremendous, and the fact that it's not for me is like, that is totally fine. Like,
Yeah.
not everything needs to be for me, and in fact, please, no. Too much is marketed for my demographic. Please make way more movies that are not for me, and it may be that I will love a lot of those movies too.
Right.
I didn't particularly love this one, but I, as I say, I respect it. Also, it's interesting that there are just a number of, it's interesting seeing Angela Bassett in this, and in
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X, and and I feel like while she's great in Malcolm X, she really, you know, she gets to show her stuff a lot more in this movie. I guess I think there's a popular GIF that I'd seen a lot of her like torching the car, and
Yeah, sure.
as opposed to the Beyonce one of torching a car, very different.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's little things like another line that stuck out for me sadly was there's a Whitney Houston line about like talking about one of the bad boyfriends and saying like, girl, what do you expect him to say? I'm a crackhead. And it's just like,
yeah.
We weren't to know that line would land differently
Right.
than it did at the time. But
Well, actually, I always wondered if Terry McMillan somewhat based the Robin character on like stories about Robin Givens. I mean, I always figured that was one of the reasons she named her Robin, but you know what? I don't have any confirmation on that, so I don't. So I shouldn't be throwing McMillan under the bus. It just seemed like that's a charged name, a character named Robin, especially to name your young sort of, she's more on the make than the other. She's a little bit more whatever you want to call, and I don't want to use the word promiscuous, but she's, she seems to be trying to use her sort of sexuality in a way that the other characters are not necessarily. And she's also a professional, so don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying like, and that kind of vibed with some stories that by 92 we'd been hearing about Robin Givens, whatever. I don't know, but I could be totally wrong there.
It was also interesting watching this like so soon after rewatching Joy Luck Club, because of course,
yes,
they're both movies centered around this sort of, tight group of women. I think in this case, maybe more personally tight than in Joy Luck Club, although they're certainly, like the younger characters are sort of thrown together by family more than anything else. Although
I think that's right.
But then also, the terrible men. Like here, I think this is more about the men being terrible than. I don't know. They're both kind of.
Well, they're both pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, considering Ron Bass co-wrote both screenplays, that's a guy who doesn't mind showing men in not a complimentary light.
Yeah. Yeah. So I sort of enjoyed that connection between the movies.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't even expecting it when I threw this list together, and then I noticed these little connections that pop up, right? Because the list is like, it's done by winnowing down. People ask me, well, did you create the list? I'm like, well, I did, but it's mostly like, there's actually a list of 1,000 films that are like must see when it comes to inclusion. I just had to kind of narrow it down. I took, how they have that thing of like the statue of like Michelangelo's David or whatever. It starts as a big concrete block and they just whittle it down. I just whittled down and I said, okay, we should probably, there's lots of movies that almost were on this list. El Mariachi was on it for a minute or two. And then I finally decided that since the whole movie takes place in Mexico, that it wasn't quite American enough for this list. I decided, but in any event, so it's hard to make these decisions. I had Aladdin. Now, another thing about Aladdin was that it's not American. It's funny that Aladdin actually came out in the same week as Malcolm X. I didn't even, I mean, I'm now going away from what I want to say about Waiting to Exhale, but just to circle back to Malcolm X, it shouldn't be the case, Sam, that like, two of the only three basically the only three major studio films about Muslim Americans ever. And the other one is Ali, starring, Will Smith as Muhammad Ali. Basically, the only times that Hollywood spent more than 20 million on a single, it shouldn't be that two of them came out in the same Thanksgiving week in 1992. And it also shouldn't be that Aladdin is so much better known than Malcolm X. I mean, this goes back to the Pocahontas conversation, but it's like it bothers me. Well, and the thing is, those are all white. Literally every actor in Aladdin is white. I checked. I looked at their photos. They're all white, so they're all in brown face. I'm sorry, but at least Disney took a tiny step forward in those 3 years by casting actual Native Americans. At least there's that. And Aladdin's. I love Aladdin. Actually, it's great, but it's also not about Muslim Americans. We don't have enough. I'm telling you, Sam, we have so few movies about Muslim Americans, and this is one of the reasons that there's such a prejudice against group, because Hollywood has totally dropped the ball.
And Islam is not it's not an important plot point in Aladdin to begin with. It's a fairy tale that happens to be from.
Well, there you go. It's probably about as accurate to anything that ever happened as Pocahontas, in terms of, what Jafar does to get the lamp is probably about as close as Pocahontas. Okay, but anyway, now I want to vibe off of what you said about Waiting to Exhale. It's a funny thing. You say that it's not for you. One thing I love about movies is that they can be for anyone. I mean, and that's a great. I think a movie has a power to break down walls that a lot of things don't have. That, like, because anybody feels like they can. So in other words, half of the ticket buyers who went to see Philadelphia, they may not even know a gay person or somebody with AIDS, but there's this opportunity in their lives to at least learn a little bit of empathy in their lives for once, and maybe not freak out the next time they meet a person with AIDS or a gay person, So I love that movies have that power. With Waiting to Exhale, I see what you're saying. I want to say something Sam, that in the 270 films covered by this podcast so far, I don't think I've ever said what I'm about to say, which is that I think this film's strengths are very closely related to its weaknesses. So what do I mean by that? Macmillan and Forrest Whitaker, they succeeded in making a film about the lonely modern professional Black woman. Yes, well done. That happened. But at the same time, the lack of high stakes makes the film feel a little kind of polished or easy. I mean, if you look at Savannah, Bernadine, Robin, and Gloria, no one has just lost a close friend to a relative to death. It doesn't begin like The Big Chill. It doesn't have that kind of motivator, because Macmillan didn't want there to be that kind of false motivator where, like, in The Big Chill, they all gather because somebody just died, and that's a common device. You're a playwright, so how often that comes up. Nobody is talking to any parent or invested in them except for Savannah's mother. No one is having trouble getting pregnant or about to have a baby. No one is a victim of sexual assault, unlike in the Joy Luck Club. No one is getting married. Relationships aren't really going anywhere despite all the discussion. The film actually, I think, barely passes the Bechdel test because of how often the women chat about men. I know the Bechdel test. I don't have to tell you that it's only when the women are talking about something other than men, and that so rarely happens in this. So the film ends with the four of them pretty much back where they started. Their four-person team kind of more important than any other relationship. So on the one hand, here's the best thing I can say about that is, there were plenty of movies about white guys like that. In other words, there were other movies where four white guys were friends and nothing really happened by the end and the movie ended. And you know what? So I get that, like, this movie was very important that it claimed that space for Black women. That I totally get. But the experience of watching it, it's so low stakes that I don't know. I'm not saying Ron Bass needs to inject a Joy Luck Club level, like, okay, here's a woman killing her own baby. I don't say you have to have that to have a great story, but it's a little, I don't know what it is. So this is what I mean by the strengths are close to the weaknesses. I just think I get that they didn't want to falsely they wanted it to be, look, here's how four women might just live in Arizona. poor black women, but I also kind of missed some of that drama. I don't know. Am I wrong? What do you think of what I just
No,
said?
no, I think you're hitting on something important here, that I love that this movie is about what it's about. I
Yes.
love that this movie is about, more importantly, I love that this movie is about who it's about.
Yes.
And I think that that in itself makes it very important and very resonant and very personally resonant to someone who is not me, and that is good.
Yes.
And that is a good thing. And it being this, romantic dramedy, whatever, is not, that in itself is not a deal breaker for me. It's just I personally found the movie a bit schmaltzy. I personally, I for a movie that is centered so much, or eventually centered so much around the friendship between these women, I would have liked that friendship to be established like way earlier in the
Yeah.
movie.
Mhm.
I only realized like maybe a third of the way into the movie that, like, oh, they know each other, they hang out, because we'd
Right.
spent so much time
Yeah.
on their relationships with terrible men,
Yeah.
both in voiceover and that it almost seemed like an afterthought that
Right.
when we finally saw all four of them like hanging out at a club, that was the first time that I realized, oh,
Yes.
these women all know each other.
Right. Yes.
That they're actually friends, and I feel like that became kind of the bedrock of the movie, and I really would have liked more time spent with them as friends, in the movie, and I feel like it would have worked better for me if it had been more centered. But I mean, that's like, you know, I don't want to give somebody notes on a movie that was made.
But
Like, oh,
you
could you only make the movie like this other thing that exists only in my head? But like,
uh,
there are things that didn't work for me, and that was one.
right. And you and I both need to be careful not to either mansplain or whitesplain why waiting to exhale should be better or whatever. I mean, I know. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just there are certain things that like didn't land as much for me, and as I say, it's totally fine for this movie to not land with me. Please don't make this movie for me.
I hear what you're saying. Another thing that gets me, so I mean, I'm a big fan of Public Enemy, the band. They wrote the song By the Time I Get to Arizona in 1991. The reason they wrote that song then was because in 1991, Arizona still had not ratified Martin Luther King's birthday as a holiday. The state did so in November 1992, after Terry McMillan had already published this book set in Arizona. And basically, it was the same month that Bill Clinton was elected and Malcolm X was released. The thing is that, you know, I, waiting to exhale, you would never, I mean, it acts unaware of this history. It doesn't even, there's no, I mean, see, I have mixed feelings about it. Clearly, unless Public Enemy has been lying to me all these years, there's racism in Arizona. You don't see it in this movie, and maybe that's good. I mean, I don't know. See, that's it's tricky to me because I don't know how to say this. I mean, it's like, I mean, maybe it's funny you mentioned Malcolm X because you could argue that Angela Bassett in this other movie or in that movie, I'm sorry, you could argue that Bassett was in a film in 92 that was almost too political, where every single choice in the movie was politicized or about something political. Whereas I'm arguing, this is a movie that doesn't want to be like, doesn't want to reduce itself to like, here's how we interact with these racist white people. Like there's a scene like that in The Color Purple where you see like the white lady. I mean, okay, but anyway, I don't know. I mean, I struggle with that because I feel like, here we are in Arizona, and you wouldn't even know we're in this state that was so racist. It's almost like proving that like Indian food can be bland. Okay, thank you for proving it, but I miss my spicy Indian food. I don't know. I mean,
Sure, but I think that again, goes back to like, I can't speak to
no,
the grand sweep of film history in terms of how is it refreshing for this movie not to be about that at all.
right.
For
Okay.
this movie to just be about these, professional, professional black women who are, and their relationships and their friendships, and not make it about white people. Um, let's leave white people out of this.
Right, because certainly there've been plenty of white movies that left black people out of it entirely. And I think that I don't have them right in front of me, but there's certain movies that are kind of like a sisterhood of the traveling pants, but for 30-year-olds, where it's kind of like 30-year-old women hanging out, chatting. Those movies that had existed. I don't have them right in front of me, but I can totally see where McMillan and the other people involved with making this movie felt like, look, we need to claim this space. We can also just be people hanging out. I totally get that. I also, but this is what I mean about the strengths and the weaknesses. I think, I miss it because I don't know. And, it's not utterly absent. I mean, there is the part where Angela Bassett is not thrilled that her husband is leaving her for a white woman.
Oh,
and,
sure. Of course.
so I shouldn't act like there's nothing. I mean, there's that scene with a guy yelling at Robin, "Oh, black women criticize. This is why you drive us to white women." So yeah. I mean, I guess.
And there's some weird politics with like the drug dealing boyfriend at that
Well,
party.
yeah, that too. Right.
I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some weird. Yeah.
There were some. Maybe I'm. Now that not. Thank you for bringing. Maybe I'm soft selling that. There is some discussion of racism. So there's. Yeah. Okay. All right. You know what? I changed my. I'll take in the middle of the podcast. I'm changing my mind. What do you think? Okay, well, I'm very aware of the time. We've been here a little while. I want to start to wrap up. This has been fun for me because as I say, it's a 100-movie list, but then we come to these tranches and then we find like, oh, wow, here's some little things that these, like Malcolm X in some ways can be put in conversation with a movie like Waiting to Exhale or whatever. So anything else we can say about these milestones of the marginalized, just these five, Sam, just looking at them all together? Is there any other generalization? Have we learned anything, Sam? I don't learn anything ever.
I mean, there are certainly threads that I can, like little commonalities between any two movies in here. Like we talked about some of the connections between Joy Luck Club and Waiting to Exhale.
Yes.
By the way, I apologize if I at any point in this conversation said "waiting for exhale" because for some reason, like there's a weird sort of verbal autocomplete that like I want to say "for" every time after I say "waiting."
Okay.
Anyway, I don't know if I did that.
I'll keep that in for the listeners just in case.
I know the title of this movie, but I mean, obviously, there's two movies with Denzel Washington, two movies with Angela Bassett. There's Giancarlo Esposito is also in Malcolm X in a small but notable
right. Yeah, some actors, and
Wendell Pierce is also in
yeah, I know. And he got started young. I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah. We have a couple movies about historical figures.
Well, it's funny you say that. I was going to say it feels like no, you know what? You challenged I was going to have a talking point about how we can be, it feels like we might go easier on a movie like Malcolm X than a movie like Pocahontas because we sort of appreciate its take on history. But no, you know what? The way you talked about Pocahontas, I disagree. I think you took them. Well, history is so tricky, right? What do these movies owe history? But I think you made it clear that for you, Malcolm X did it basically right. I mean, you didn't have Pocahontas-like issues with Malcolm X. You didn't think that they had skipped over some major section that was just crucial. Well, I did, like with Ella and everything. But for you, it was fine.
Well, and also, I think that there are a lot of people who would probably still feel, well, I mean, obviously with the whole CRT thing, there are people who would feel very threatened by that movie.
Yes.
And so I feel like because I personally feel like this movie really got this person right. I'm sure there are plenty of people who feel like, no, this movie should have been way, way harder on Malcolm X. I obviously do not feel that way, but
yeah. Well, you just scared me into thinking how many of these CRT haters are going to be like, here, watch Pocahontas instead. This will tell you what really. Well, no, they wouldn't do that.
Well, they wouldn't do that because there's songs about like how terrible we are, and then it makes them.
Well, so there, you know what? Pocahontas must be doing something right in that case.
Right. I feel like they would have been very pleased with like maybe the ending of that movie, but not the beginning.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Probably they like Peter Pan, where what makes the red man red. That's probably closer to their style. Anyway, sorry, I'm just throwing everybody under the bus now. But you're right, we could find little commonalities. But I mean, the bottom line, it's an interesting period of Hollywood. It was, as you said in the opening, it was a time when people were just, we were hearing voices that we had. It was kind of ridiculous that a lot of these movies hadn't already been made. Why didn't we have Black professional women in their 30s with their own movie? I mean, come on, that it's just crazy to think how long we were waiting for some of these movies. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, that I think is a real commonality, I think, between all of these movies is you're like, my God, it's about time.
Yes. Right.
And also I think, there is also a real baby steps
Yes.
theme between a lot of these movies. I say, with the notable exception of Malcolm X, where Spike Lee said, screw that. Screw the baby steps. That's
just walking. That's not baby steps. That's walking.
Let's take one of these big strides, one of these big strutting strides from earlier in that movie, by any means,
like wearing your
movie by any means necessary.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. No, thank you. It's funny. It's almost like Spike Lee directed that movie like he wasn't sure if he'd ever even get to make another one, and I love that about it. Like he's not in my mind, he's not hedging he's not like keeping it safe so that he'll get a job later. And if he had, I would have defended him for that, but I love that he didn't. And more people need to see that, and they shouldn't be thinking, hey, it's 3 hours, I can't handle it. It moves quick. I'm sorry, but it does. It's not slow. If you can sit through 3 hours of Lawrence of Arabia or Gandhi, you can do that, or 4 I don't even know how long these movies are. Malcolm deserves that much of your time, which is something he knew, which something Spike Lee knew. Okay, well, cool. Anything else before I thank you so much for being here? What else am I what am I forgetting?
I can think of. I mean, this has been fun.
I had a great time. I sincerely did. You're welcome back when I throw together another season someday. You're an insightful man. You know about films. I love it. No, it meant a lot. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, Sam, and I truly mean that.
Well, thanks, Daniel.
Let me just say in my little outro, it won't take but a few seconds. We're finishing off next week. We finish off the 20th century. With 5 more milestone films that cover some bases that we didn't get to cover today. Those 5 are The Watermelon Woman, The Birdcage, Selena, Smoke Signals, and Boys Don't Cry. I hope you'll join me. Until then, save me some popcorn, because there's always another movie to see.